So it's live. It's going live on YouTube now. I'm gonna make you the host again, Tony,
Thank you.
in a sec, and
No
then
problem.
so you'll be able to click the button in the top left to view the stream, copy the link, and then end the stream. So I would just tell your students, instead of sending their friends and family the Zoom link,
Mhm.
send the YouTube link to them.
Will do. And until we start, John, I'm going to share my screen with the agenda on it so that if anyone tunes into the YouTube live channel in advance, they see that we start at 2. They know what we're doing.
Nice. That's
The
great.
students are so professional. I want to make sure that, I'm not bringing that down.
Yeah, no, that's really good, Tony.
Cool.
Okay,
Thanks for
cool.
everything.
I'll be watching on YouTube.
Oh, good. Talk to you
Yeah.
later. Thanks for everything. See you soon.
Bye.
Hopefully. All right, I'm gonna do this. How does that look? As a way to make sure everyone, and I have to make a note to myself to stop the.
Good. Now will they see me? I don't see my image.
Yes. You should be able to fix your controls so that you have like all the people and this. And obviously when we get started, I'm going to remove this so that everyone's picture is larger and everyone can really see everyone else, even if they have a small laptop screen.
But from my side, the only image of another person is you, not me.
At the top, is there a little place you can click to have a multi-pane view? It's like,
Oh,
kind of like 6 dots, like 9 dots, like
sideline. Yeah, we're good.
Okay. And just to go over it with you, because obviously there's always concern over the lag between when I click forward and when the student who's presenting sees it. They're just going to pause until they see it, and then they start talking. And if any of them have a particularly long pause, when it shows up on my screen, I'm going to give them a little thumbs up so that they know that it's visible. The next slide's visible. They can start talking, and then I'll give them I'm going to do this when I clicked forward. If it's a slide that's taking a particularly long time to load.
Okay. Hey. Yeah.
We are on YouTube Live at the moment. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that coming in. So they're already streaming this in, Nick came in and set it up for us, just so you know that this is live and being recorded. Always important. I told the students that if there's any instance where you tell me to move forward and it's taking a little bit of time to load, I'll just put my finger up like this so you know that I did click forward, and we're just taking a minute. So I'm going to put my stuff on mute as well. See you soon.
Unknown caller.
Hello, Cleary.
Hi, John. How are you?
Oh, wonderful. All good. Thank you.
Good. Hey,
So
Tony.
very
Kind of.
nice.
Hello, hello. It's so good to see you. We are already on YouTube Live, the channel that the school's using to broadcast. So I'm just letting everyone know when they come in. Not that I expect anyone,
Smart idea.
you know, just as a courtesy.
That's
Thank you
right.
so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation. You know, I love coming in and doing this with you guys.
I'm very excited. Everything really is right in your wheelhouse. So I think that the feedback and comments you're going to be able to provide are going to be really useful for the students.
Great. Look forward to it. We have just started our summer classes today, so it's
Oh, wow.
funny how the different schedules are at the different universities.
Yeah, that's early.
And you're teaching this summer, Cleary?
I am. I'm actually teaching an online preservation course for urban planning students. We have a Master's of Urban Planning degree that's an online program. So for working professionals who can squeeze in, degrees at the same time as work. So we developed an intro to historic preservation for urban planners. For them. And it's really exciting. I just got everything loaded and published, and today is the first day of class.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
See,
pretty
a
exciting.
class, one could have a whole program at just that scale of participation.
Yeah, well, and I think the really great thing about these sorts of overview courses is it really shows the variety of the discipline, and really you
Right.
can do so much with it. So we're actually covering affordable housing and climate change, and
Gotcha.
underrepresented narratives. So it's just everything. So it's great.
In detail, we touched on, I think, all of that in this one course, but it's
Yeah.
naturally not as deep, perhaps. But
It's good. It's good for the students to understand that's all a part of it, I think.
well, you will see they have been very, very busy and produced a huge amount, of which we're only showing about 75%.
Yeah.
Just we had to edit down, but that's what happens when they invite a bunch of fellow past New Yorkers in to go for it.
I am just periodically letting everyone who's joining us know that we are already on YouTube Live. Nick has set it up in advance. So just as a courtesy to everyone coming on, that you are fully aware of where we are in terms of sharing and streaming.
Good. We'll wait a few minutes for a couple of others.
And John, when you're ready to get started, just let me know. I'll stop sharing my, agenda screen and start recording for our backup copy of the presentation.
So you want the agenda screen to be up while I introduce the day?
I was gonna remove it so that everyone can see everyone's faces on a slightly larger scale instead of the share screen.
Fine.
And then I'll press record then, and it'll help
That's
me remember when to do it.
I have a PDF of it on my on my screen, so I can see it with or without slide.
Okay.
Waiting.
And Cleary, about half the students have a final exam an hour after we complete today. So, yeah.
Ouch.
One of those
And then
Mondays.
hopefully that's
Right.
it for them. Then they can sleep for a week. Is this a A first year class?
No, this is an exit course,
Exit
the
course,
second
that's right.
semester of the first year of the program.
Got it. Okay.
So it's been wonderful to see how everybody's used all they've learned going back to August, the previous year,
Yeah.
brought it to service with this kind of work. Did it
So
work?
John, I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. I know that Brent is going to join us when he's able to, and he's been involved throughout the entire semester really for the students. And I'm assuming that this Errol as well. So it probably would be good to start now. We have all the students with us, and I will press record when you're ready for me. Okay, wait, I'll let Mary record.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Stubbs, Kristovich Senior Professor of Preservation Practice at Tulane University. And with my dear colleague and friend, Tony DiMaggio, we have led a course in the School of Architecture in the Master of Preservation Studies program in particular this semester.
Can you hear me, Mia?
That has been most exciting.
A guy was looking at my roof. I had to get rid of him. He's gone.
That's
Right.
okay, Errol. We're just starting, Errol. We just got underway. Thank you so much. So it is a pleasure indeed to welcome you all to the
I
finale.
can't hear you guys.
Are you on mute or unmute? So.
Yeah, say something.
Hello, it's Errol. We see you, but we don't
Are you
hear you.
muted, or do I have to restart my computer?
We can hear you, Errol.
We can hear you. Maybe
Let
you're
me
on.
restart the thing. Hold on a second. This is what happened before.
So to continue, this is an exit course for the students in the Master of Preservation Studies program. And thus far, they've had 2 busy semesters in learning about everything pertaining to historic preservation. And in this particular course, we've addressed preservation at the urban scale. And we're all very pleased to say that the students have done a marvelous job of incorporating all that they've learned thus far, in addition to what they brought to the program in the first place, and applied it in this, in a sense, capstone course within the MPS program. And the formal name of the studio is Studio 2 Urban Conservation. And the way we ran this project this semester was to introduce 3 separate projects. One was, and they were in ascending order of complexity and scale, if you will. The first was about a 7-block section of Lower Esplanade Avenue in New Orleans, sandwiched between the Vieux Carré and the Marigny district, excuse me. So that took about 4.5 weeks. And building on that, we dealt with a much larger section of a different kind of urban fabric and another stretch of Esplanade Avenue. That will be the second project presented today. The third project is quite a different scale, different nature, different content altogether, looking at how to prepare for sea level change, flood mitigation to be precise, in the amazing historic town of Mandeville, Louisiana, on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. So the theory of teaching this course was to start with the basics and heavy on documentation, research, analysis, toward prescribing solutions and strategies for accomplishment of historic preservation strategies at these 3 sites, which we think are representative of the kind of urban conservation challenge that all of us are facing across at least the United States. So that's a bit about the structure of the class. And so this day we're presenting all three projects in summary form. Each one was may have involved another 30% more work than we'll be presenting today, certainly in the way of slides. But we've edited that down for this presentation today. So there'll be 3 presentations today with a break in between, just a stretch break for a few minutes. And then we finish with the 3rd project. So I'm very pleased that we have 3 very distinguished guest critics with us today, who are new to this class's work this semester. However, they're all old friends of the program, so they generally know what we do in the Preservation Studies program. And you all will be serving as our primary respondents to please respond with the critical observations right after each presentation. But then at the very end of the afternoon, there could be perhaps more general observations about the nature of the course, if you will. Anyway, we really have a great lineup in Clary Larkin, PhD from the University of Florida, is tuning in to us. She's with the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience, which is so perfect as a background for this particular assignment we've given you today. Clary and I are old friends from way back at Columbia University. She's got a lot of distinctions to her credit, widely published, and a real star in the field, based at the University of Florida, who has been a guest critic for this program before. Next is everyone's favorite professor in the School of Architecture, Errol Barron, who is just so special as an accomplished architect and a very distinguished professor, long-standing role as a professor in the School of Architecture, first degree at Yale, and has got more degrees and credentials and awards than we can all imagine. Errol has been a personal friend of mine forever also, and has very much, we appreciate your joining us today. Errol will be bringing the perspective of a practicing architect who certainly worked a lot at the urban scale. He certainly knows a great deal about building in New Orleans with all of our preservation challenges. So he knows the system well, and we so much appreciate your joining us, Errol, with your valuable time. Another star in the crown of this program.
I'm pretty sure that if I jump in, his computer is going to unstick the minute I say that, but I believe he was starting to introduce Brent Fortenberry. Oh, John, there you are. You froze up, and I don't know if you had introduced Brent again.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I will, in case there are interruptions like this, Tony and I will kind of fill in for each other, but pardon those in advance. No, to back up a little bit, we're very thrilled to have with us today as well Dr. Brent Fortenberry, the next director of the Master of Preservation Studies program at Tulane, who succeeds me. I couldn't be more thrilled about that. Brent joins the program in early July to really be its leader in full. At the moment, Brent is helping the program in all kinds of ways like this, in part because a lot of what Brent does with this mastery of digital documentation is very relevant to what this very class is doing. So Brent, thank you ever so much for being with us today. We're thrilled to see you again. I also see an alum in the mix, Elizabeth Simpson. We go back. She's an earlier graduate of the program, and we're very happy to have her join us this day. Great to see you, Elizabeth. So that's it for introductions. Tony DiMaggio and I will do our best to be the kind of managers of this, time managers or whatever, and the students have practiced and hope they have the timing of all of this correct. And if we without much more ado, we should probably let them get underway. The various critics have read the project statements, so it should be pretty clear what our objectives here, which are how to read a cultural landscape from the standpoint of urban preservation at 3 different scales. So over to the presenters of Project 1, please.
Hello. So as Professor Stubbs said, in order to envision a future for Esplanade Avenue in terms of making preservation recommendations, it was useful to understand how it developed, how it's been used, its character, its roles in New Orleans history. Next. So I'll quickly take you through some of the history we found compelling and relevant to our study. We started by looking at the development of Esplanade Avenue over time. In terms of Esplanade's importance, we pointed out how significant it is that Esplanade lies on a ridge created by alluvial soils from the shifting Mississippi River. Indigenous people used that ridge as a trail that connected them from the river to Bayou St. John and ultimately Lake Pontchartrain and the Gulf of Mexico. They showed that shortcut to European explorers and settlers, which was monumental because the location of New Orleans was determined based on this ridge that afforded access to the river and lake. So for about 100 years after the city's founding, Esplanade was part of the vacant land just outside the fortified boundary. Over time, private owners built plantations on some of that land in the latter part of the 18th century mainly. Next. To protect the city, the colonial government built military fortifications that stretched from the foot of Esplanade to what is now Rampart Street. Next. Esplanade became a grand promenade starting around the 1820s when a lot of well-to-do people, well-to-do Creoles left the French Quarter and built grand houses along Esplanade. The street grid was squared up, but there are lot lines that still reflect the old diagonal fort boundaries, as you can see indicated by the dotted red line on the block plan. Next. It was important for us as we studied Esplanade to paint all facets of its history. Esplanade Avenue during the first half of the 19th century was a busy area for the US domestic slave trade, with several slave pens and trading sites operating in our study area. Ads offering rewards for runaway slaves were common in newspapers. And this was interestingly one of the few ways that we got any detailed descriptions of the qualities and talents of enslaved people. Next. Esplanade was becoming a grand promenade, but its close proximity to the port meant it was a gateway for sailors and other voyagers looking for entertainment. Gallatin Street, a 2-block stretch of barrooms, dance halls, and brothels just behind the US Mint, contributed a certain color to the neighborhood. Eventually, the city moved the Gallatin Street activity to Storyville, several blocks away. The riverside of Gallatin was torn down in the 1930s to expand the French Market, which in that photograph on the bottom right, that's the French Market all the way in the background there, up that street. Next. By the 20th century, Esplanade was residential in character, but also a major thoroughfare with lots of shops and businesses and a streetcar line. Next. Which brings us to present day Esplanade and the wide range of roles it continues to play in the city as a venue for festivals and big public events, as a place that's trying to mark its history, as a place where people live and work, but also a place that has increasingly accommodated short-term visitors, temporarily as an outdoor living space taken over by young travelers, and as a rather beautiful linear park.
Our area of study is the lower portion of Esplanade Avenue between the Mississippi River and Rampart Street. As Lynette had mentioned, long before European colonists arrived, this land was inhabited by Native American people, namely the tribes of the Chitimacha, Muskogee, also known as Creek, and Choctaw. Evidence of transportation by canoe was found dating as far back as the year 450. Pictured on the lower right is a Chitimacha canoe that was unearthed in Assumption Parish. Next slide, please. The tree-lined street we know today was first represented and planned by 1817. The bicycle was invented a year later. The Pontchartrain Railroad wasn't introduced for another 15 years, and by the time the railroad connected Lake Pontchartrain to the Mississippi River by steam engine, Lower Esplanade was already a bustling modern American promenade with a busy wharf and carriage routes along the avenue. Next slide, please. The New Orleans City Railroad Company began offering public transportation along Esplanade by mule-drawn streetcars, also known as bobtail streetcars. This is the primary type of streetcar used throughout the city until the streetcar system was electrified. In both the following photos, we see the presence of electrical poles, which give us a look at the street in the years prior to industrially driven modes of public transportation. Next page, please. The electric streetcar along Esplanade was the first line to run from the river to the back of town at Bayou St. John. This line was part of the Greater Canal Esplanade Belt, which connected the city through public transport in a way that made it easy to access the city core without a car. The belt outlined in yellow shows this connection. The electric streetcar in Esplanade operated from 1901 till the 1930s, at which time the system was changed over to buses. Next page, please. So in the 30s, we also see the introduction of the private automobile. The image on the right shows these various modes of transportation coming together at once with the old rail lines, the relatively new minibuses, the private car, and pedestrians using the neutral ground. Next slide, please. The major difference in the bus route, both in this map from the 50s and today, is that the bus routes no longer reach all the way down to the river at Lower Esplanade. The historic role of transportation along the Esplanade corridor shows Esplanade as a vital connection between the river and Bayou St. John. This role of connectivity might be a point of consideration for future preservation planning and furthering equitable access to the businesses and public amenities found along this historic corridor.
So moving from history to examining current conditions today, we each use Sanborn maps to examine development over time. Next slide, please. The orange box in this diagram shows the block that was pictured in the last slide, but this brings us to the current conditions today. Next slide. So our study area is primarily residential. There are some commercial and hotel buildings mixed in the residential area, and there's also a larger commercial chunk towards the river, including the start of Frenchman Street and the Jazz Museum. Next slide. The businesses that are located in the area serve as amenities for residents, including restaurants, the mini mart, and even a pet care center along the Esplanade Avenue. Next slide. Another amenity in the area is the green context. There are private green spaces within each block, but the neutral ground along Esplanade also serves as a public green space, in addition with the Cabrini Park, that's a block off from Esplanade, and the green space around the Jazz Museum.
You can skip this one. Dana already spoke to it. So these elevations are from a representative block of Esplanade Avenue between Bourbon Street and Dauphine Street. So you can see it's mostly residential, but on the far right, there's the Port of Call restaurant, which I believe also has some apartments upstairs. So each person in our studio created elevations for their assigned blocks, and this one was mine. This block shows a diversity in structural types and architectural styles, which I'll speak to more in a moment. Next slide. We also made rectified photo merges of all of our blocks as well. And this is the one I created of my cross street showing the Dauphine side of my block. Next, thanks. This representative block of our study area has a range of architectural styles and associated character-defining features, including Ionic columns, octagonal pane sidelights, Italianate hood molds, raised parapets, stained glass windows, Eastlake millwork, and even corner turrets. Just in this one block, it's easy to see how these features reflect the changes in architectural styles in the 19th and 20th centuries here in New Orleans.
Hello, I'm Daniel Nora, and I'll be telling a brief comparative analysis on one of the most notable architectural features on Esplanade Avenue, columns. The house you see illustrates the implementation of the types of columns which are on Esplanade. We have the Ionic, the Corinthian, the Tuscan squared, the colonial traditional post column, and the brick pillared square column. It is important to note that the examples of the colonial traditional post columns along Esplanade may deviate from or slightly combine the carved ornate features of both a colonial post and a traditional post. Furthermore, many of the brick pillared square columns have been stuccoed, allowing the bonds of the bricks to be concealed. Next slide. The most common column seen directly along Esplanade Avenue is the Tuscan squared column. The least used is the Corinthian column. Our largest structures, the Hotel de la Monnaie, features a set of Tuscan squared columns. Second largest, the US Mint or the Jazz Museum, uses a hybrid of both Ionic and Tuscan squared columns. The commonality of columns may relate to the ease of artisanship to produce them. Corinthian columns tend to require fine detailing and expert craftsmanship. On the contrary, Tuscan squared, which is most common, columns are rather less ornate and require less artisanship, allowing greater supply and cheaper acquisition. Next slide. While many of the Esplanade Avenue buildings use the same types of columns, the respective buildings may differ in style and materials. For example, our Ionic column shows the US Mint Jazz Museum implementation, which is used at large scale, commercial, and masonry-based style, while its counterexample below, which is 520 Esplanade Avenue, is a residential scale building with more wooden elements. Similar differences can be seen with our Tuscan squared example, in which one building, the Hotel de la Monnaie, is rather new, built in 1984, while its counterpart is an historic mid-19th century residence. Thank you.
So this analysis focuses on the street furniture found along Esplanade Avenue between River and Rampart. The term street furniture itself is used to designate objects and pieces of equipment installed along streets and roads for various purposes such as accessibility, activity, utility, pedestrian mobility, and road safety. Next. So one specific analysis of the street furniture I focused on mapping was accessibility. So the largest category in this being signage. So the various signs found along this stretch are almost overwhelming with information pertaining to street names, parking restrictions, parking time durations, penalties, and a variety of other information. And in some cases, the signs no longer exist, but the poles that support them remain. So they're offering no information, and just a large variety of now are existing that no longer have use. So now an evaluation of the existing signage could be made to analyze which signs are necessary and which are defunct or overwhelming. Next. So another specific analysis I focused on was activity. So both actual furniture and historic markers or plaques are locations where you see the most people actively interacting with a piece of street furniture for long periods of time. Next. So some of the street furniture has evolved over time while others have remained the same. And then certain street furniture objects have remained more effective than others. So this evolution can be seen, for example, with the presence of both historic street lamps as well as modern street lamps. The use of the modern street lamps have also evolved, and that they also can support signage or other utility equipment. But overall, Esplanade Avenue currently supports a wide variety of street furniture, but a lot of it's very overwhelming. So a consolidation of these pieces, like the signage, the removal of defunct furniture, and the better integration of existing pieces into the historic context would greatly benefit the area. Next.
All right, so my colleagues Laurel and Mia and I studied the evolution of residential density along Lower Esplanade, and we compared 1885 to 1950 and to the present. So over time, Esplanade's luxurious 19th century mansions have been split into multi-unit complexes to meet housing demand and to account for changing demographics. By understanding the area's changes in density, we can hopefully make more appropriate decisions for its current residents. Using Sanborn maps and contemporary data, we separated our findings into 3 categories: single, double, and multi-unit buildings. The pie charts here represent the proportion of these categories within the residential buildings of our study area. So as you can see in 1885, we found that most residential buildings were single family. The 1950 data reflects the enormous amount of change that happened at the turn of the century and beyond, as immigrants, artists, and writers all flooded into the French Quarter seeking low-cost housing. And lastly, in 2021, we see a further increase in multi-unit residences as mansions have continued to be subdivided into apartment buildings and luxuriously branded condominiums, some with upwards of 25 individual units. Next slide. So as we look at our study area in 2021, we're able to get a bit more specific with the data. So from lightest to darkest here, we have single, double, 3 to 4 unit, and 5+ unit. Out of the darkest and densest buildings, the majority of them are directly facing Esplanade. And this is partially because these buildings are more often the largest and thus have the greatest potential for subdivision. But it also says something about the decline of the mansion as a symbol of conspicuous consumption in this neighborhood. Esplanade Avenue has lost that association in place of higher density, which has implications on who its residents are and what they want and need in their neighborhood. At the same time, the fact that many of these mansions are still intact on the exterior shows that Esplanade has very successfully adapted to these new housing patterns without compromising its historic fabric. Next slide. So in a related investigation, I used the 600 and 700 blocks of Esplanade as a representative sample to map patterns of absentee ownership. So for the purposes of this analysis, absentee ownership is defined as either an individual or a development company whose mailing address is outside of Orleans Parish. Their secondary properties near or on Esplanade Avenue may either be investment properties or second homes, and this is compared to full-time owner occupants or local landlords. What I found was that 48% of the units surveyed are locally owned and rented, 29% are full-time owner occupied, and 23% are absentee owned. And these numbers align with some of the findings of a comprehensive housing market analysis of New Orleans that HUD conducted in 2018. This analysis found that between 2001 and 2005, absentee owners' sales only comprised 11% of total sales in Orleans Parish, but 10 years later, obviously after Katrina, they comprised 34%. So this is definitively a growing trend. And you can see here in the center some of the locations of these absentee owners. And this is just within this 4-block area. We have owners from all across the country and even a few in British Columbia. Next slide. Luckily, if we overlay our conditions assessment onto the absentee owned properties, we don't see any significant pattern of neglect, but obviously this is a relatively recent phenomena and the impacts are more likely to be visible on a social and cultural level. An increase in second home properties that are often vacant can have negative impacts on the social cohesion of a neighborhood. Next slide. And lastly, this is another one of the maps that Dana produced that shows a significant number of either vacant or currently for sale properties in this area as of a few months ago, showing that there is an opportunity for this trend to potentially continue. Next slide.
So moving forward, these next analyses are specific case studies and proposals. So this proposal focuses on opportunities for the 703 Esplanade Avenue parking lot. This parking lot is located on the corner of Esplanade and Royal, and it's owned by the Stream family. The Stream family has had a strong presence on Esplanade Avenue for decades, and they are large advocates of preservation in the arts. They currently own multiple properties around this area, but this is their only one on the Marigny side of Esplanade. And then this has to be mentioned, this parking lot is also the site where Franklin and Armfield's slave trading compound existed from 1833 to 1836. So this is a physical reminder of the slave trade that existed on Esplanade Avenue. Next. So after assessing the current effectiveness of the present parking lot and its location, I experimented with different parking layouts using different degrees of parking stalls, as well as a new circulation path utilizing Royal's one-way street. Zoning ordinances were considered when designing changes to the parking lot, and the layouts would satisfy the two referenced ordinances seen on the right. For the surface of the parking lot itself, the use of green pavers would help keep this parking lot as a living entity and pleasing to the eye. Next. So through referencing the HDLC design guidelines, as well as knowledge we gained from 2 studio guest speakers from the VCC and the HDLC, I came up with 3 potential fencing designs to replace the existing chain link fence. These options include brick masonry with ventilation holes and cast iron fencing of 4-foot and 5-foot heights. The final design is a 5-foot fence being utilized as an art fence. And this is what I propose would be the recommended choice to go with. So next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, the owners of this parking lot, the Stream family, they've acted as stewards of historic fabric and they're supporters of all types of art for decades. So this would be a good opportunity to make a partnership with the local historic metalworkers and helping keep master crafters alive. So the collaboration with a local master crafter like Daryl Reeves would be a great opportunity to construct a fence that promotes New Orleans traditional ironwork. Another opportunity for collaboration can be found in creating this art fence through attaching these slim, tall panels to the iron fence. These examples are from the African American Museum in Tremé, and they demonstrate how the fence structure isn't completely covered and visibility to the parking lot behind would remain. So as the parking lot is, it remains very much functional, but there are many opportunities to help better integrate it with the Esplanade Avenue landscape, as well as better connect it to the community itself. Next.
Okay, so in New Orleans, the rise of shipping and railroad industry has left the city without much access to its riverfront, leaving only a few slivers of accessible property in areas like Crescent Park, the Moonwalk, or the Fly. In addition to reconnecting the riverfront, New Orleans also faces the uniquely challenging issue of parking in a historic city whose infrastructure predates modern vehicular needs. So these are some map images that detail past riverfront development proposals and suggestions. These maps come from the New Orleans City Planning Commission's Riverfront Vision 2005, and although these graphics are almost 20 years old, they still shed light on issues that we're facing today in this study area with regards to parking, green space, land use, and transportation. The first map in the top left depicts the existing riverfront transportation, and we can see this medium blue line showing where the streetcar ends, and it offers the insight that the extension of the riverfront streetcar could help spur riverfront development by creating better access to the sites and by reducing traffic and parking impacts of development. The next map in the top right depicts major land use and zoning recommendations, which shows our study area along the riverfront foot of Esplanade as a mixed use area. This map was used alongside the recommendations of increasing open green space along the riverfront and the possibility of extending the Moonwalk along Governor Nichols Wharf and maintaining existing park and open space at the Vieux Carré riverfront areas. And finally, the last map touches on land use, zoning, and transportation and access recommendations by the City Planning Commission for riverfront development. Different areas of the riverfront are divided into sections for recommendation, and we can see that the wharf section of Esplanade is suggested for possible future redevelopment to park or low intensity commercial uses, as well as the 2 parking lots along Elysian Fields. So like I mentioned briefly before, these images are almost 2 decades old, but are still extremely relevant to riverfront development issues in New Orleans that we're facing today. And the issues of parking and transportation will remain at the forefront of the needs of New Orleans citizens and visitors alike. Next slide.
As Hannah introduced, the foot of Esplanade is the point of important new riverfront development. The Esplanade and Governor Nichols Street wharves are the last remaining point of connection between Woldenberg Park, the Moonwalk, and Crescent Park, as you can see in the map on the left. In 2017, the Port of New Orleans acquired the Public Belt Railroad from the city in exchange for the wharves. There are plans to develop this portion of the riverfront into a park, although they currently remain closed to the public. Next. So with street parking already taxed in the area, a need for more parking is a major consideration. Currently, there are 2 parking lots at the intersection of Elysian Fields, North Peters, and Decatur, here in yellow. They are owned by the city and zoned in the historic Marigny Tremé Bywater Commercial District. So in place of the current parking lots, Parking garages would alleviate congestion for residents and make a trip to the area much easier for visitors. Across the street from these parking lots is the former Claiborne Steam Electric Generating Plant, one of the last remnants of the Pontchartrain Railroad, that is architecturally representative of the immediate industrial surroundings of the Marigny. So at the bottom here are facade diagrams by Morse Ajmi. He draws from the fundamental elements of industrial era facades to create modern interpretations that suit their historic surroundings, but would never be mistaken for an imitation of the past. Next. So the blind arcade of the power plant has an alternation of supports with engaged Tuscan columns separating bays and entryways and windows framed by arches and pilasters. The recessed frieze of the entablature sits below a parapet with recessed crenellation. Next. Borrowing Morse Ajmi's method of diagramming and interpreting the power plant's facade breaks the rhythm of the facade down into its bays with vertical, horizontal, and curved elements of columns, frieze, and arches. Next. The arches of the power plant have 13-foot wide openings. Scaling the facade up by 1 foot proportionally meets code requirements for a parking garage entrance and sets the building height under the code requirement. Adding bands around the arched openings and vertical detailing between them, achievable in textured concrete panels, mirrors the archivolts and engaged columns of the power plant. The guardrail of each parking garage level reflects the window muttons across the street, and openings in the parapet are framed with horizontal metal screens that emulate a recessed frieze and the spacing of brick coursing. Concrete coping atop the parapet grounds the facade. Next. So by designing with the fundamentals of its across the street neighbor in mind, transformation of the current parking eyesore can increase functionality for both the area's residents and visitors while adhering to zoning regulations and the existing streetscape.
As we've shown earlier, Esplanade has had many roles and functions over time. And so that opens up a lot of possibilities for historic interpretation. And I've offered several potential ways to represent those histories. Digital reconstruction is available as a tool for recreating missing heritage. Virtual tours, 3D renderings can give people a sense of what's been lost. There is an opportunity to recreate Gallatin Street's lost buildings virtually and view them in the field, for example. Next. Projection mapping can help show what buildings once looked like, but even more powerful, perhaps, it can recreate historic events by projecting moving images on the sites where these events occurred. There is an opportunity to recreate the siege of the US Mint by Confederates in 1861 as a part of acknowledging military history, for example. Next. Murals have been used quite a lot around the city to depict history. Art panels and paper monuments, if you will, can be applied to existing structures. One upside to these applications is that they're low impact. That is, they're not permanent. Sam's already mentioned that there's an opportunity to revamp the fence in the parking lot at Esplanade and Royal with art panels. Next. Sidewalk pavers that mark historic boundaries are pretty compelling, like the one that shows where the Berlin Wall once stood, and the one that shows the former South Beach shoreline in San Francisco. So wouldn't it be interesting to show, at least in places where it is possible, the boundaries of the old military fortification? Next. Something else that's useful to consider is the placement of small, unobtrusive elements to mark history. Small panels with bits of information and barcodes that can connect to greater detail can be integrated into existing street furniture. Living labels like those used on the 19 Crimes wine bottles make use of augmented reality. So using a designated app, you can point your cell phone to an object and see it come to life, the way the thieves on the wine bottles come to life to tell you why they're in an Australian prison. Next. So what histories to interpret? Sometimes this question is answered by groups who see an opportunity, step forward and do the work of marking history. Sometimes there's a call for ideas and efforts, as there was during the city's tricentennial commemorations. But as these observations of history take place, we continually need to ask who or what is missing. One entity cannot answer this question alone. We need to tap the local community through charrettes, through consulting with cultural leaders and so on, for input on what and how to interpret the histories that belong to this corridor.
The Main Street approach to planning is a means of community transformation that combines 4 overall points, namely economic vitality by cultivating an entrepreneurial ecosystem, organization through community partnerships, promotion for the sake of business and event marketing, storytelling and placemaking activities, and other design approaches that embrace historic character and people-centered public design to make the area a pleasant place to live and visit. Some recommendations via case studies here are and next slide, please. And also Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And so though this part of Esplanade, Lower Esplanade, may not fall into the conventional Main Street way of thinking or criteria outlined by the National Trust, where efforts are primarily driven by business development, it's worth thinking about this area as having its own identity as a mixed use, but primarily residential pocket within the city. Certainly an identity which has a unique variety of historic layers from which to draw inspiration for both formal and informal modes of social and cultural programming.
Thank you so much. And as I believe John mentioned, we did have time at the end of each of the 3 presentations for discussion specifically talking to that project. And then we have discussion overall at the end. So just due to the amount of work and the variety of the topics. So please feel free to take the next 10 minutes and we'd love to hear your feedback for the students.
Maybe I'll start and just sort of throw out the question to everyone. You know, you all have collected so much important architectural, historic, interpretive data and possibilities. I guess my question to not just the students, but to everyone, you know, how do we begin to operationalize this work for the benefit of stakeholders in the community? What can we do to make good use of this work instead of it just being filed away in a report? What are some avenues that we can begin to utilize this preservation data for the benefit of the neighborhood? And by the way, I agree. I love the artist fence. I think that is amazing, and we should make that happen.
I have a request. I'm the secretary on the board of the local VC Pora community French Quarter sort of advocacy community here. And I would really like to have this presentation to give to the rest of the board. It addresses some of the questions we have concerning the French Quarter. And just to answer your question, Brent, I think that perhaps one of the next steps is to reach out to some of these neighborhood advocacy groups and just say, you know, this is what we've studied, this is our presentation, and do exactly what you just did. You know, it was great, visually compelling, very readable. Wish we had a little bit more time so I, you know, could get into it. But if you send it my way, I would appreciate it. I'd share it.
I think I'd like to first just say I really appreciate the amount of information that you took into consideration. It is architectural, it is history, it is planning and zoning, and it really provides a very comprehensive understanding of this part of Esplanade. I think one of the things that I'm kind of curious about, a few of the takeaways that I have, I could speak to like every single topic that you covered because they were all really well done and really done in depth. It sounds like you've identified very few challenges for this area. It sounds like there are a couple of parking lots that, you know, have opportunities for redevelopment, for interpretation of history. I think that kind of node at the wharf between Elysian Fields and Esplanade is critical to this street and really deserves urban placemaking. And I really appreciate, you know, the kind of analysis of how Morris Ajmi does, you know, diagramming and interpretation of historic facades. You know, just thinking about that as a gateway and a pairing for that. I think one of the things that would be helpful for this, Lynette, I appreciate your what histories to interpret. That's always a great question. But the question that I have is really, what are the other challenges, and from the residents' perspective, and maybe this is where Elizabeth's participation and collaboration comes in, because there is such a, I was really impressed, the low absentee ownership on this street. So it'd be a great opportunity to put on your planner hat and get out there and actually interview the residents and find out what they're concerned about. You know, how do they feel about these uses of the street for festivals or for races? I'm thinking about the neutral ground as a great public space. I mean, I love this street. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. And it's that kind of quiet respite, right, from the French Quarter and that transition into the Marigny. So I think the next step would be to really kind of consider things from the qualitative and residential perspective. And that might help really kind of identify how you could put this great work to use, like Brent said.
In partial response, if I may, on behalf of a student who's unable to be with us today, it's Daniel, Kelvin Flores, who unfortunately had to drop out of the program, but not before he did this amazing design for the foot of Esplanade as it joins the river, where of course we all realize this is the all-time great riverside development opportunity that's just right for the place, connecting the city and the avenue back to the river. And speaking for the students, didn't feel comfortable presenting his fabulous drawings today without Kelvin being present, but we sure thought about it. Yeah. And I might add too that the dean, in some research his class has been doing, Dean Inakialde, was one of the many guest presenters or resources for this class. And he showed some ideas he had for pedestrianization of Lower Esplanade as well that we took into account.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Of that sort. So we're thinking of this. And to your point about there not being a huge number of problems, that was kind of one of the aims of the exercise. We all know it's so very well preserved due to the fact that landmark designation of different levels of strictness on both sides. But that's what made it all the more interesting, is to see that there aren't so very many problems, but for those that there are, we should really go to town. Mm-hmm. But anyway, thank you for those ideas.
I'll just respond to you quickly, Clary, that we definitely wanted to do, I think, in all of our projects and ones that are coming up, like public participation is something that obviously we would have done if we had more time. I think it's this year obviously made it more difficult, but yeah, I don't know. It's just makes me think about studio as a space for experimentation. And so it's like sort of real, but it's sort of fake. And it's like hard to approach someone with a really short timeline. And it felt weird, especially not having that many opportunities to speak with the community as much as we would have liked. It's hard to kind of make a recommendation confidently because you don't want to necessarily be like forcing something on a community. But yeah, I think that's very much like a forward-looking goal for all of these projects.
Absolutely. I think that's a great groundwork set up for that. So it's a long project.
I agree with Clary. I think there's a great groundwork right here to dovetail into that next step of taking it to the people who live in the French Quarter. I live in the French Quarter. And two of our major concerns are the short-term rental situation and how that would dovetail into the demographics, that sort of historic demographics that you presented. And also just street life. I mean, the ghost tours right now are just way over the top, and we can barely walk down the street without just weaving in and out sidewalk, and that's Esplanade too. So yeah, just really taking all of your research to the people. What's going on? You know, what do you need? And there's a lot of different historic, groups here that would be willing to talk to you. I'm sure they'd be willing to talk to you.
I should have said in introducing the projects more clearly, we had probably 25 outside resources speak to the class, like Daniel Hammer and Howard Margot and Anne Masson and Jane Bodie, big time stakeholders in the area or who have special perspectives on it all, Gene Sizik. And so there was a good bit of query about teasing out what people think about it, but we did not have the chance or feel comfortable in doing surveys on the street of just average users. We thought it was a little bit hard to do with a negative population in the area due to COVID and also whatever, but we certainly see the importance of listening to the monument.
I think oh, sorry, go ahead, Brent.
One thing I'll just add is that, one thing that I've done elsewhere in Bermuda is it's critical to map changes in the historic built environment over time. And so if this data could be put into, say, a geodatabase or a shapefile layer, and then you can engage stakeholders in the community, they can become your sort of first line of check and understanding how the historic character is changing over time with respect to both the architectural character, but also the condition of the building. And so, one of the things that I am constantly finding sort of frustrating about these exercises is that you all went into this neighborhood for X number of weeks, and then you're on to something else. But that change and that churn over time isn't necessarily captured until the next time somebody does this in 20 years' time or something. And so to be able to have a mechanism and a platform for those changes to be mapped on a much shorter scale, I think would be an incredible service that the program and heritage stakeholders could give to the city moving forward. Something that the planning office doesn't have the capacity to do just because of resource strain.
Yeah, I think along with that, what's so interesting about this street is it really is kind of, it is the border of the Vieux Carré Historic District and the border of the Marigny Historic District. And so it's almost like a transect, if you will, of, these two sort of neighborhoods coming together. And so thinking about that change over time and these two districts, how they might provide a little bit of larger context for what's happening on the street. And then thinking about how that context relates to the larger city as a whole, which I have a feeling we'll get into next. But, the idea of the Creole, moving out of the quarter and into mansions, and then later moving, up towards the lake and along the ridge. And so you have a great start to kind of those demographic shifts too, which really starts to impact the physical fabric of this street. So thinking about the population density and those multi-families living in these mansions along Esplanade. So even just thinking about like the census numbers, I noticed, I think it was Emma was looking at the residential density. You have 1885 and 1950. My favorite period in New Orleans is 1920 and 30. And so I think that would be another great time period to really look at what's happening with population movement there.
Errol, any observations?
I'm just thinking, what to say about all this, because it's, from the point of view of the practicing architect, the thing that is what drives all of this work or these ideas is the economy. People having money to spend, wanting to move into places and pay the properties that they're inhabiting. And so I think from a planning point of view, it strikes me that this is probably not what you want to hear, but it strikes me that the point where the most fertile ground for something to happen is where the street intersects the river. The rest of it is so incremental and so conditioned by individual properties. The fact that there are lots of renters, I just don't see any way that a broad stroke can be made other than through maybe signage or planting and landscaping and stuff like that. From an architectural point of view, it seems to me that the greatest opportunity for something to happen is where the street hits the river. And I know that I don't know this guy who did it, so I don't know what he did, but it would be interesting to see that. Because that's where the street intersects the River Crescent Park developments that are being considered now, and some of which have been done. And that's the kind of infrastructure that you would expect to happen because it's such a particular part of the street. And I find that, this is not probably what you want to hear, but I find the sort of small scale decisions that are required to do things with individual properties almost overwhelming, and I don't know how you deal with it. So it strikes me as much more of a street furniture and landscaping issue. And if you want to think of things you could do architecturally, you'd have to get a really critical spot like the river to make a real impact.
Right. Yes, indeed. We certainly picked the project with those problems in mind, like connecting with the river and the incredible development of the public belt, giving way to the city for making that a developable area. And so we certainly gave it some thought, and whoever picks this up in the future, this is the perfect place for an RFP for world architects or whatever to propose ideas for connecting the river to the city in this historic location. As we wrap up here, unless there are any final comments by anybody, I would just like to salute the students all for this. This is the first project in this, looking at the city at this scale. And I have to say, the previous courses Mike has just been most impressive. Kudos to all of you for digging the history of this area. Now, this is the fun part for Tony and myself are to pick the projects. And this is a most amazing project due to the enormous history that happened underfoot here, from the original Indian portage, which was the raison d'etre for New Orleans, of course, was right along this stretch. The fortification, who knew there was a fortification there except a few scholars? So we've discovered that, we're representing that. The whole history of transportation in New Orleans is an opportunity to present right here. And these many, many other histories, like Lynette alluded to. So that's what's at stake and special about this class, this whole program, is we're embracing the dimension of history in our work. But I think it was also selected as a project as a kind of up the avenue that we should go to now.
So as Professor Stubbs was saying, for project 2, we looked at Upper Esplanade. The next section focuses on our study of Esplanade at North Claiborne. The most dominant feature of that area is the elevated expressway built in the 1960s. Next. On the left, we can see what the expressway replaced. That photo was taken on the North Claiborne neutral ground looking east where Esplanade crosses it. And of course, on the right, we can see what replaced what's on the left. Next. In our study, it was clear that the historic built environment of Esplanade, of the corridor, is generally well preserved, as we've observed in our comments just now. Structures facing Esplanade Avenue in particularly are generally in good shape. This is in part due to much of the corridor being protected by its inclusion in regulated historic districts, as Professor Stubbs alluded to. It turns out that for the entire length of Esplanade Avenue from the river to the bayou, all buildings facing the avenue are in full control areas, meaning a commission has to approve new construction and all exterior work to a building visible from the right of way. For the portion of Esplanade adjacent to the French Quarter, a commission has to approve new construction and all work to anything in the district that the air touches, and other portions of the local historic districts are in partial control areas that mainly oversee demolitions. Next. Esplanade is also included in National Register districts. While those districts do not conduct demolition or design reviews, they do offer the possibility of commercial developers earning federal tax credits that could help them undertake major rehabilitations on historic buildings. They also trigger heightened scrutiny of federal projects that might negatively affect historic places. Next. One glaring exception, a historic area in the Esplanade corridor that lacks protection and benefit of being in a historic district, is the 7th Ward. The 7th Ward historically was a neighborhood of artisans and builders, musicians, Creole cooks, culture bearers. Most of the 7th Ward is excluded from both the local and national historic districts. And I've developed some proposals for cultural heritage preservation in this area, which I'll share later in our presentation. Next.
So the second section of this presentation is talking about blight and underutilization and overall disinvestment. So blight, as we know, is a complicated issue, and it's something that has historically disproportionately affected poorer neighborhoods, which are then often inhabited by people of color. Although blight has affected New Orleans for many decades, damage from the construction of the Claiborne Overpass, as well as from Hurricane Katrina, exacerbated it. While many houses were unable to be rebuilt. And some of the affected houses may still remain left behind, decaying further each year, and some have been leveled. Vacant lots are also a reminder of the ghost of what once inhabited this space. Next slide. So we started with the walking survey of our area, identifying properties and lots that might fit within our criteria for vacant and blighted buildings. According to the Committee for a Better New Orleans, the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, the word blight refers to a property that is chronically vacant, has unresolved code violations for unsafe, unsanitary, or unhealthy conditions, has been declared a fire hazard, has been so neglected demolition is imminent, and has a substantial negative impact on the health, safety, or economic vitality of a neighborhood. Next, we started to pull the information we were gathering into a spreadsheet database using Google Sheets, as you can see on the screen. And we utilized the tax assessor's website to pull ownership information, lot and building square footage, zoning, and previous sales, and we also cross-referenced with historic Sanborn maps. The purpose of this spreadsheet database was to keep our information organized and easily accessible or shareable should this information be helpful to anyone else in the future. Next slide.
Although this neighborhood has seen hard times in the past, it is recovering well. There are fewer cases of blight and vacant lots in the Esplanade Ridge area than in other neighborhoods of New Orleans. But while progress has been made, there's still more that can be done to help this neighborhood heal. These are all of the areas we found in our walking survey of Esplanade Ridge. There are 39 vacant lots shown here in orange, 7 blighted properties shown in blue, and in total about 200,000 square feet of underutilized space. There is a concentration of vacant properties along Claiborne Avenue on the right side of this map, closer to the overpass. And altogether, there are about 2 whole blocks worth of vacancy in the study area. Next. We found ownership information for these properties from the Orleans Parish Tax Assessor's website. So 56% were owned by private individuals who varied from next door neighbors to people as far away as New York and even Anchorage, Alaska, although generally they were based in New Orleans. We were surprised to see private ownership be the most common, as we thought developers looking to turn a profit would be the majority of owners. 18% were owned by developers who were different LLCs and incorporated businesses such as Basement Realty, Icon Properties, and our personal favorite, a less original hipster LLC. 15% were owned by nonprofit community organizations such as churches, Providence Community Housing, and Home by Hand. And finally, 13% were owned by government organizations such as the Housing Authority of New Orleans, or HANO, City of New Orleans, and the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority. Next.
So on our survey, we noticed different levels of necessary interventions throughout the neighborhood. In total, we found 7 buildings that fit our criteria of blight. And in assessing the levels of blight, we split the properties into 4 categories that represent increasing levels of severity. So the categories are minor in yellow, moderate in orange, major in red, and destroyed in purple. The destroyed category also represents the vacant lots, as this is the final and most irreversible stage of blight. Next slide. So properties that are in slight disrepair from neglect but are not in urgent need of attention are the minor category. These properties appear to have been uninhabited and are in need of mostly aesthetic changes. Necessary changes are not structural in nature, and they might be the quickest fixes and probably the most cheap. Next slide. So the moderate category is properties that are in slight disrepair from neglect but are not in urgent need of attention. These properties appear to be uninhabited and are in need of mostly aesthetic changes. Necessary changes are not structural, but they might also be a relatively quick fix, but not quite as quick as the minor categories. And they might be more at risk for elemental damage as well. Next slide. So the major category is properties that are in urgent need of addressing, are almost completely open to the elements, and are in immediate danger of being destroyed. Luckily, there was only one property that fit this category, and it's this building that it doesn't have a roof. You can see the sky through the windows. So that's in the major category. Next one, please. And then finally, the destroyed category, which these are showing all the vacant lots that we surveyed, which are properties that are no longer extant and a vacant lot remains in their place. And once a property is demolished or destroyed, it is irreversible to put it back to the way that it was. Next slide.
The area around Claiborne and Esplanade has changed dramatically since the introduction of the Claiborne Expressway in the late 1960s. The form and function has changed, but some of it is obvious while others require a bit more analysis. Next slide, please. According to the 1945 New Orleans City Guide, in the 4 quadrants around North Claiborne and Esplanade, there was at least 1 vendor of fresh fruits and vegetables. And in 3 of the 4 quadrants, there was at least 1 medical provider in the form of a general practitioner, dentist, or pharmacist. Next slide, please. Today, you see less of a variety of businesses, and as you can note, there are no vendors of fresh fruits and vegetables, and there is 1 medical provider, a dentist. Next slide, please. As we zoom out, we can see that this problem is very widespread. Residents in the area have to walk multiple blocks to get fresh fruits and vegetables, and general practitioners and pharmacists are many blocks away, actually more in Bayou St. John than this area. So you have to have access to a car, public transportation, or be willing to walk multiple blocks for medical access. Next slide, please. As is often the case, when you begin to lose businesses in the area, you lose the physical fabric. And since the Claiborne Expressway was created, we've lost a one-story apartment building near the corner of Esplanade and Claiborne, as well as a two-story dwelling. Next slide, please. One block back, keeping Claiborne Expressway on our left, we've lost a one-story garage, a two-story double, which has been reconstructed, but half of it is at a greater setback. And we lost two buildings. One was a one-story double and one was a 3-unit multi-use business. Next slide, please. Any new construction would ideally keep the community needs in mind. In this case, it would be appropriate to add two-story buildings, given the physical context of the neighborhood with two-story buildings all around. And given the lack of medical providers, it would make use or it makes sense to introduce this as perhaps a medical facility, perhaps with a general practitioner's office, a dentist, a pharmacy, or some combination thereof, just due to the proximity of Claiborne. Next slide, please. One block back, again, keeping Claiborne to our left. The scale of the neighborhood would permit a two-story building. On the lot to the left, this is zoned for business. So again, we could add a multi-unit business complex, and the two-story stature would provide some protection from the noise pollution that comes from Claiborne Avenue, which is often overwhelming. To the right, these two lots are residential. And again, for the scale of the neighborhood, a two-story set of buildings would be appropriate and would add some rental apartments. Next slide. Any proposal that we put forth for Claiborne should not be simply to fill an architectural void. We need to keep in mind the health and well-being of the residents, and anything that we consider needs to be done by keeping that at the foremost of our minds. Thank you.
So by detailing the history of building and cultural evolution from neighborhood to interstate surrounding the Claiborne corridor and its intersection with Esplanade Avenue, one can see the resilience of the residents and opportunities for further integration of the corridor into the everyday use of the community. Next. So just general history for time's sake, but I first looked into the Claiborne corridor as it existed pre-overpass as the center of the historic Treme neighborhood, where Claiborne was once a grand avenue, and at its center was a large neutral ground with a string of oak trees. Surrounding the avenue, as Stephanie was saying, there were a lot of homes, storefronts, retails, and other businesses, as well as churches and community centers. Pedestrians frequently accessed this avenue and neutral ground, and it was viewed as a place of pride and belonging for the Black population. Next. So the extension of the interstate through Claiborne first began being discussed in New Orleans in the 1950s as a part of the city's plan to revitalize the CBD and to relieve it of traffic congestion. The plan began in 1957 as the state acquired 155 individual properties along Claiborne between Tulane and St. Bernard that they then cleared away along with over 200 oak trees to make way for the 1968 construction of the interstate. And then while gas stations had already existed at intersections before the overpass, these images from the 1970s show how both concrete and the automobile dominated this once green neighborhood, the only green exceptions now being the remaining neutral grounds on avenues like Esplanade. Next. So today the Claiborne Avenue overpass, it may be a scar from a deep historical wound, but it has since grown to play a central role in the lives of many since it was built. Drivers grew to rely on it. The Claiborne community created a world beneath it. Residents have found ways to decorate it and use it for recreation, markets, community events, especially relating to music due to the acoustics under the overpass. And the overpass has since effectively become a part of the lives of the current residents. Next. So during the city's master plan after Hurricane Katrina, there was recommendations that they should consider taking down the Claiborne overpass to return Claiborne to its historic roots, which began a whole debate that it still exists to the present day. This removal would not be without precedent. Cities like San Francisco, Boston, and Portland, shown here, have all undergone huge highway removal and reroute projects that have been relatively successful. Next page. So much time and effort has been put towards this potential removal since it was first proposed. In 2010, the Livable Claiborne Communities study proposed several possibilities for the future of the Claiborne Overpass, ranging from leaving the infrastructure as is to removing the entire 2-mile stretch of it and all the connecting ramps. Shown here are 2 options for the interstate removal demonstrated by the Smart Mobility Inc. and Wagner and Ball Architects 2010 report. The results of the LCC's findings published in 2014 left the Claiborne question very open-ended. While the community resoundingly agreed that all revitalization efforts must protect and prioritize cultural authenticity, provide jobs and opportunities for desperately needed economic advancement, and offer aggressive efforts to manage flooding and drainage, no decision could be ultimately reached on whether or not to remove the overpass. So recently, talks concerning the future of the overpass have begun anew with President Biden's infrastructure plan, specifically citing the Claiborne Overpass as being a site where a highway divided a community he is hoping to redress. Next. So while the interstate removal is still being debated, the remaining residents that live in the neighborhoods around the corridor would greatly benefit from the integration of green spaces and new programming engagement. So the identification of existing neutral ground spaces, green spaces, and current empty lots of grass or building foundations so that there's room for many opportunities. Green integration near major overpasses and interchanges is prevalent around the world as a way to create sound barriers for nearby neighborhoods to beautify these massive concrete monsters, and as a way to allow for local interaction in areas that have been affected by construction. So looking at these other cities presidents shown, I show how a nearby currently empty lot on Esplanade and Claiborne could be better utilized as a green space. Next. So the previously identified existing current empty lots are now considered for their potential for programming, engagement using the New Orleans City Council zoning for future land uses. So the future land use around North Claiborne is focused on mixed use buildings comprised of residential, neighborhood, and limited visitor-oriented businesses on the historic core side of Claiborne, with the main focus being on convenience and walkability. So by looking at precedents of local stores in New Orleans, as well as Baton Rouge, as well as restaurants and community programming, you can see the many potential ways that these lots can be better utilized. Next. So overall, the topic of overpass removal is it's a highly sensitive, polarizing issue that elicits emotional reactions from the residents throughout the region, and therefore it does demand a lot of thoughtful and thorough study and participation from the community. While the overpass itself has been adopted into local culture, the surrounding blocks are still affected by the trauma from the construction, and a focus on working with the community to identify community needs and implementing them would help make the efforts of the interstate intrusion less jarring and more accessible to and utilized by residents. Next.
Here, I'm making some recommendations for cultural heritage preservation. Next. My first preservation recommendation is to establish new 7th Ward local and/or National Register historic districts. The unprotected parts of the 7th Ward continue to suffer from preventable demolitions of the historic fabric. These designations would bring about more scrutiny. Next. My second preservation recommendation is to amend slightly the National Register District Statement of Significance for the existing Esplanade Ridge Historic District. I would extend the period to what is allowable, 1970, 50 years ago. And I would add a statement that points out the district's importance on the cultural heritage front. Next. My third recommendation is to create the historic Claiborne Cultural Heritage Trail. The neutral ground would be the anchor. The trail would be a way of bringing awareness to lost history, but also valuing what is still there while planning for what could serve the community. A Claiborne Esplanade circuit, kind of an offshoot of the larger trail, could focus on the area around that intersection. Here, I've highlighted some of the sites that could be featured on the Esplanade circuit. The idea is to create a branded trail that would have a printed brochure, an online digital tour, barcoded landmarks tied into an accompanying app, perhaps a podcast. Next. This is a sample of one site that could be barcoded, Little Dizzy's, a beloved Creole cafe on Esplanade Avenue, 1 block off North Claiborne. Next. standing in the middle of Claiborne Avenue. I don't recommend it, but if you happen to find yourself there, you would be able to hold up your phone and through augmented reality, get a glimpse of what the avenue once looked like at certain hotspots. This is at Ursulines Avenue. We would place markers at certain spots. For a short time around 1889, civil rights activist Homer Plessy lived in the 1100 block of North Claiborne, 2 blocks off Esplanade on the downtown side. He's the plaintiff in the landmark 1896 separate but equal case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that brought about Jim Crow laws in the US. The red box in the photo on the left marks the site of Plessy's home. It's not practical to put a marker on the actual spot where Plessy lived because it's difficult to get to it due to the high-speed traffic. But the ground across the street under the overpass can be marked. The sample marker at the bottom here on the right actually depicts buildings which the Plessy marker could conceivably do. Next. I also looked at public spaces that are conducive to hosting movable historical markers, living monuments, impermanent displays, and programming. Next. And of course, we would want to communicate and collaborate with neighborhood folks, local institutions, and any other stakeholders to shape our ideas at the beginning of any preservation planning.
All right, now we're gonna keep moving up Esplanade and narrow in a little bit on some specific sites. Next slide. So starting with some context about Upper Esplanade and its settlement patterns. I know we've already been introduced to some of these topics, but the intention here is to specifically illustrate the evolution of the street grid over time, which will inform some of the proposals to come. So topographically, the area is defined by the Metairie, Gentilly, and Esplanade Ridge system, which is the result of a former channel of the Mississippi River. This channel would flood and subside, depositing sediments that created natural levees. And on the left here, you can see contemporary elevation data, which shows the remnants of that former channel in green, and our study area for Project 2 is indicated there. Naturally, these ridges became important places to travel and settle in a landscape of primarily cypress swamp. So Bayou Road, which is marked on the center 2 maps in yellow, is particularly well known, as we've already discussed, the Native American portage road that led from the river to Bayou St. John. And second from the right is a section of Charles Zimpel's 1834 planning map that shows Bayou Road as it was becoming more formally developed in the American era of the city. So in the background of that map, you can also see a fainter grid, which is the projection of several new neighborhoods that were about to be built. And this includes the expansion of Esplanade Avenue towards Bayou St. John. And so many of the idiosyncrasies of this area's street grid can be attributed to city planning right at this moment. And then another influence on the street grid is just the myriad of smaller infrastructural changes that have occurred over time, such as the widening, so to speak, of some stretches of Esplanade in the early 20th century, leading to its unusually skinny neutral grounds. Next slide. So now we're just going to move into our focus studies. Next slide. So I'm going to start us off with the research that I've done, which is still somewhat of a broad perspective, but it's going to be looking into the intersection of Esplanade Avenue and Bayou Road and the interstitial spaces of this area, what are sometimes called pleats in the street grid. So in this project, I was interested in learning how interstitial spaces were formed, as how they've been used, and then how buildings and neighborhoods have adapted to them. So I set my scope between North Pryor and North Broad Streets. And you can see in this area, we have examples of some flat iron architecture on the bottom left. We also see these spaces being landscaped as parklets. And lastly, on the right, these spaces have been utilized for the purpose of placemaking through monuments and public art. And I argue that there is an even greater potential for this type of use. Next slide. So here's one example, Andre Caillou Park, which is in what you might call the Bayou Road neighborhood. This park has been a site of placemaking in a number of ways. It was recently renamed very intentionally for Andre Caillou, the first Black officer in the Union Army to be killed in combat during the Civil War, who also happened to have strong ties to this neighborhood. In terms of physical placemaking, there's no signage here, but there is a sculpture by local artist Robert Tannen, which has been there since 1980. And in 2014, it was enhanced by students from the local Bricolage Academy through a mural project, as you can see at the top. And at the bottom, you can see a picture of how this space is used on a typical weekend for social gatherings. Next slide. So Andre Caillou Park is just one aspect of this larger intersection that represents the incredibly rich and layered history of this small neighborhood. It's at this site that the Esplanade and Gentilly ridges meet, and so it's always been a space for gathering and commerce among the local Native American tribes. In 1809, the site became the central node from which Faubourg St. John was laid out, and where landowner Daniel Clark placed his estate. Then from 1867 to 1946, it was primarily the site of Le Breton Public Market. And though the market had taken on a new name, locals continued to refer to the building in the area as the Indian Market even into the 20th century. Today, the market building hosts a church and an Afro-Caribbean emporium. Next slide. So today, Bayou Road is an extremely vibrant community with this intersection at its core. A number of active neighborhood associations have worked to revitalize the area with an emphasis on encouraging Black entrepreneurship. In the last decade, Bayou Road was the recipient of a pilot project for facade renewal funded by the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, which greatly enhanced and stabilized its historic fabric. In regards to public history and additional placemaking, there is an opportunity to acknowledge the intangible history of Native Americans in this area through, at the very least, a historic marker as sort of workshopped here. The parklet photographed here is a central location that sits at the approximate location of the former Native American trading hub. And from the few conversations that I was able to have with residents, it's clear that they're extremely proud of this and all aspects of their neighborhood's rich history and would likely be on board with such a proposal. Though a modest recommendation acknowledging the Native American history in this place through this plaque goes hand in hand with other efforts for Indigenous rights, such as the movement to reclaim a former name of New Orleans, Bulbancha, which is the Choctaw word meaning the place of many tongues. Next slide.
The interstitial pleat of Esplanade and Grand Route St. John stands out in having newer, cheaply constructed buildings separated from the sidewalk by an expanse of impermeable parking. Next. Many elements of this particular block work well. The park is an asset to the neighborhood. The corner that houses Cafe des Gars and Nana Mia is active at the street's edge. And the house on the opposite corner is very well taken care of. And Splish Splash Washateria remains busy, although it is in need of major repairs. However, the intersection of Esplanade and Grand Route is an anomaly in its underutilization. Both of these newer buildings have changed hands frequently. One has been empty for several years. The other seems to be successful as a restaurant and cigar bar called Don Villavaso, but is unappealing to those who don't seek it out as it is set far back from the street and visually interrupted by the parking lot. Next. Looking into the history of the block, I learned that these lots were home to a multi-generational plant nursery and florist shop, which is why they have been underdeveloped and have no setback structures like the rest of the block. So to improve on what is unsuccessful from both a visual and economic standpoint, the deeply set back businesses, I propose removing both buildings and constructing a new home for the restaurant, moving it up to the property's edge, and providing a generous covered patio for outdoor dining. And the portion of the lot that faces the park becomes a plant nursery again, serving the neighborhood and its many churches, wedding venues, and event spaces. Next. Here are precedents for a combined plant nursery and restaurant. In our case, this idea would provide the restaurant patio with a more appealing atmosphere and create a visual connection with the park across the street. Next. Many of the commercial buildings in the fairgrounds have some version of a storefront. According to the HDLC, the storefront is one of the most significant features of a retail commercial building since most people are experiencing buildings at the ground floor level. So I followed the cues of the Splish Splash Washateria's storefront since it is immediately adjacent to the restaurant building. Next. The newly designed storefront is compatible in size, pattern, material, and color with its neighboring storefront. Next. Following HDLC guidelines, both entryways are recessed, acting as transitional space from the sidewalk to the entrance and some protection from the weather. This also allows for the new storefront to have a ramped entrance. Both facades feature large display windows with mullions and a bulkhead at their base. While the Washateria's windows bump out, the restaurant windows angle inwards towards the entrance. The Washateria has a prominent barrel tile overhang. The restaurant has a shallow overhang in line with its neighbor that extends into a deep patio overhang. And the restaurant has a single pitch, low slope roof with a 3-foot tall parapet to conceal mechanical equipment and scuppers for drainage. Next. Materially, the restaurant and plant nursery borrow from the Washateria's tile roof and using terracotta blocks for dividing screens and fences, continuing the edge of the no setback streetscape of the block. Next. Turning the empty building and parking lot into a plant nursery will visually relate the facing part, align the no setback streetscape with a statement fence, and allow the newly refreshed restaurant that mirrors its neighbor to benefit from atmospheric greenery it currently lacks. Next.
All right, so for this project, I studied the Luling Mansion and its surrounding contexts. Next. Luling is located just off Esplanade near both the fairgrounds and the bayou. Next, please. So Luling Mansion was designed by James Gallier Jr. And built in 1865 for Florence A. Luling, who was a German-born merchant who made his fortune off of tobacco, cotton, and sugar. And the 3-story, 5-bay mansion was originally accompanied by 2 wings on either side of the building and sat on 30 acres of land that included gardens and a lake with an island. Luling sold the mansion to the New Orleans Jockey Club in 1871 after his sons reportedly drowned in the bayou. So the Jockey Club utilized Luling Mansion as their clubhouse from 1871 to 1899, and they also used the surrounding grounds for a bunch of stables. Next. Shortly after the Jockey Club sold the property in 1899, the 30 acres that the building sat on began to be subdivided, and the outbuildings that flanked the main house were demolished. By the 1930s, the main house was subdivided into apartments, and the neighborhood that surrounds the building today was built. Luling was designated as a historic landmark by the City of New Orleans on October 4th, 1977, and the security fence that surrounds the property today was added in 1994. Today, the building is owned by a group that's calling themselves the New Orleans Jockey Club, and they've owned it for about a year now, and it's still currently in use as apartments. So Luling is currently located in a really rich cultural district. It still sits in the 1930s bungalow neighborhood, and that neighborhood is surrounded by the fairgrounds, which hosts events like Jazz Fest, St. Louis Cemetery No. 3, and to the south, there is a institutional center with a bunch of churches and schools, and then the Bayou and City Park are also within walking distance. However, the neighborhood is very disconnected from the surrounding context. Most people don't even know that this building exists because it is blocked off on 3 sides by fences, and the entrances to the neighborhoods are very understated. Next slide, please. So the first suggestion for revitalization in this area is to replace the fence with something that's a little bit more sensitive to the historic context. And that could be influenced by either Luling itself or the bungalow neighborhood. Next slide, please. Luling also has potential for improvement, and my next few slides cover a few options for the future use of this historic landmark. And it also examines the potential impact these options have on both the preservation of the building and its connection to the surrounding context. And so this first one is to go back to its original use as a single family residence. This option is the most sensitive to the surrounding neighborhood context, but it would need a fairly wealthy family to be able to properly preserve the building. Next slide. Next option would be a multifamily residence. This option requires the least amount of work on the building as it is currently already in use as apartments, and it is still sensitive to the neighborhood context. Next slide, please. The next option is a little bit different, and it's an event venue. This creates a connection to the larger cultural district, particularly the fairgrounds and events like Jazz Fest. And it provides a space for local community to hold small events like weddings or little parties. However, the building would have to be modified in order to meet safety and accessibility codes associated with an assembly space. Next slide, please. And then the last option here is a bed and breakfast. This option creates a connection to the larger cultural district, but it is still fairly sensitive to the quiet neighborhood context. But again, this option would have modifications needed in order to meet safety and accessibility codes.
So I chose to focus on the former Musicians Union Building located at 2401 Esplanade Avenue. And I say former Musicians Union Building because the building is currently vacant and has been for years. Next slide, please. In looking at the Zimple maps and Robinson Atlas from the site's earliest colonial settlement, on the left, we'll see the dotted lines noting the emergence of the tree-lined Esplanade Avenue and the formation of pleat parcels, as Emma and Lindsay had mentioned earlier. Presently, this location is surrounded by prominent cultural institutions like the Museum of Free People of Color, the Degas House, and the Joan Mitchell Center, in addition to the many small businesses located along historic Bayou Road, like the Community Bookstore and Cafe Pagoda. The Musicians Union Building sits in a central location in proximity to such valuable cultural assets and neighborhood amenities. Next, please. The building itself, designed by Harold Piquet, was once home to the local chapters 175 and 496 of the American Federation of Musicians, which is a national union organization that provided a gathering place and support for the city's professional musicians since 1902 and 1926, respectively. The union still exists and has an impressive membership base, including President Deacon John Moore, Vice President Vanu Gibson, Jermaine Basil, Aaron Neville, Andrews Osborne. The list is pretty extensive. The building has a significant cultural history as a former epicenter for professional musicians in the city, and also may be considered architecturally significant as a rare example of mid-century modernism on Esplanade Avenue. Next slide, please. So we can see an aerial view of the site, thanks to Nick Lakowski, our digital fabrication manager here at Tulane. And what this is showing is the Musicians Union Building on the right and its relationship to Bricolage Academy right across Esplanade Avenue, pictured on the left. Next slide, please. So began with conditions assessment of the building, and so categorized it into some basic drainage, materials, biogrowth, and damage to assess what work needed to be done on the existing building. And so the overall idea is that first, we save the existing building, and then we make an analysis or like a feasibility or recommendation on how to both preserve this building and also develop the site responsibly. So recommendations here are to replace the vertical wooden louvers, remove the graffiti, adjust the landscaping, fix the roof with regard to drainage, replace some broken windows, and remediate the mold that has formed on the interior. Next slide, please. So looking at it on the site and then looking at zoning, on the right, you'll see the allowable uses based on the district where it's located. And so for the purposes of this feasibility study and recommendation, we chose educational facility and offices. So historically, with the Union Building, on the left, you had assembly, reception, practice space. And then on the right were primarily offices, which is a 2-story portion. Next slide. And so on the left, you see a site plan, and then there's some general numbers about the site itself. And then on the right, just some conceptual massings, schematic in nature. The top one is mirrors the existing modern structure. And the general idea was that you want to build on the existing site to prevent the demolition of the historic structure. And so on the top, you see we had a mirroring approach. And then on the bottom, taking more from the orientation and the scale of the neighboring 2-story American townhouses. The building is hugged up against the far end of the lot to allow parking to weave and green space as well in between the two structures. Next slide. And this is just a visualization of maybe how that would play out programmatically. And so keeping the most publicly accessible and busy program components towards the corner of the street. And then on the left, using whatever would get developed there for more private, maybe classrooms or private offices. Next slide. And these are just some general sketches and concepts. Didn't make it into full-on schematic, but some pre-design ideas of how to take mid-century modernism and maybe adapt it to regional modernism or more climatic sensitive design approaches that include porches, covered areas that would fit within the HDLC guidelines. Thank you.
Well, thank you all students for that beautiful presentation. As our guests can see, this is a different kind of urban preservation in some respects. We've tackled things like vacant lots, issues of circulation, like the amazing historic Claiborne overpass expressway dilemma that's in literally the national news these days, and other things. So that's, which brings to mind why we're doing all of this. And in fact, why we're all in Tulane in New Orleans studying preservation is the incredible amount of authentic variety to the historic fabric of this city. So just think of the range that the students have undertaken, addressed in this and the previous project, all on the same street. So, but you see where they were invited to, in the sort of spirit of having a team approach, like a giant studio or an architectural office, if you will, select areas along using their sense of their imagination and their senses of what are problems, listening to the monument, if you will, pick their own projects. And that's exactly what these students have done, and have done their documentation, their planning and recommendations for change. So commentary from our distinguished guest, please.
Well, I'll speak first since I spoke last the other time. This is very, very impressive. The kind of intelligence that's been brought to bear on this research is quite impressive to me. And you know, it's I keep thinking, you know, what is the difference between the role of the architect and the role of the developer? And you know, these are, I keep thinking, you know, that these are in a way, you know, they're not really architectural projects. They're more ideas about how architecture might be brought to bear on the sites if something were to be done. And I'm, you know, coming from my particular perspective, you know, my firm always came in late, much later. I mean, we really were not developers. I think it was a weakness in a way of the kind of practice I was involved in, because, you know, the developer is the person who starts the idea out, and then you have it evolves into an actual project. So I was particularly taken by those projects where, you know, where that aspect of the you know, the potential of the project was touched on. Like in Mia's project, I really definitely kind of related to, you know, what would you actually do on such a site? And I had the advantage of talking to Mia about this site earlier in the semester. And I know she's rhapsodizes a little bit about that building that's on the site, but to me, it's a rather second-rate building, to say the least. And I think the last thing I would do would be to try to duplicate it. But, you know, I mean, you know, it's a very, very interesting thing, the way architectural education has evolved from people who were being trained, as I was, to do the actual projects, to now, you know, how do you develop the thing? How do you get it going? You know, and, you know, that's a very, very different set of skills. And what I do admire a great deal about the work you all have done in this semester is the quality of the research. It's intelligent, it's detailed, it's sensitive to the environment. It's got, you know, in terms of what you would do next, not so much, you know, because I just see a disconnect between these kinds of analytical surveys and the world of architecture, which is a tangible, physical kind of thing, the world that I know and or that I had experience in. So I compliment you all really and sincerely on the quality of the research done, but there's a gap between that kind of research and these real projects. You know, I have a rather mundane view of how the world works, because I would like to get into one of these things and do something about it, but there's a huge gap between that and where does the money come from? What is the governing organization that would oversee it? Who are the clients, et cetera, et cetera? You know, it's a complex world, you know. Not a very cheerful overview, but I think a fairly accurate one.
Well, I will say before there's a reaction more widely, this is a preservation planning course. And so indeed, planning per se. So there is a lot of thought that goes into the, shall we say, questions of programming and imagining possibilities within the legal boundaries and what would be right for the community. And this was really, like all the others, did involve some consultation with locals about what they would like to see, and listening to the area about what's missing, what left, and why, blah, blah. So students, please respond to Errol's good observation about.
Well, I can respond. I feel like it's hard to design something, I think, without that client relationship, especially if you're coming from a place where you're very sensitive to the context and you're doing all this research, and then, you know, it's kind of like the missing ingredient is, you know, taking your sketches and then showing them to someone else and then having that conversation with them back and forth. I think that's one of the most fun things about the field that we work in, and noted that I wish I would have had even a pretend client to develop it further, but it was still a fun project.
Absolutely, and you know, it's just, you know, it's just so hard for me to overcome the you know, the missing client, you know, basically, to put it in a nutshell.
I just wanted to say, I mean, I absolutely agree with your comment. It was such a fine line that the students really had to to walk for all of the projects is not having a client not wanting to come in and basically impose onto a neighborhood some ideas that they had after doing research and analysis. And I should also mention that a little bit less than half the class have architecture backgrounds, or are also currently architecture students. And so I think what we really got was sort of a sensitivity to that, but also just this like incredibly widespread interdisciplinary interest that pulled together so much information that actually any one of them could, from an architectural or a planning or even some sort of historian-based profession could really, develop in very specific ways. Yeah. But it is true. No, I absolutely agree with you. I think that's something that everyone was really sensitive about, and was a difficulty for, having to come into these areas that they're not necessarily familiar with.
And on the other hand, you could argue that there's a kind of freedom in this kind of research that, maybe a developer who's ultimately concerned with the bottom line, is this really going to be something I can invest in? Would not have the freedom to do. So I mean, this kind of research can really lead somewhere. It's just it's early in the sequence of events that would cause a project to happen. Perhaps it's early in that way, but early but essential.
This is
You're breaking up, John.
I have not the best connection. How about now? Better?
That's good.
Okay. Sorry. Could you hear me now? Is this okay?
Yeah.
No? Okay. Anyway, just to be brief, in this program of this nature, we find ourselves doing a lot of imagining from about clients and their perspectives. But I'd say more than anything else, the kind of nature of all of our outcomes are prospectuses, our proposals, or ideas which could be done. And in that connection of over the years, and even in relation to these three projects you'll be hearing today, we've had people say, I want to know more, I want to help, let's run with some of these and get some stuff built. So we're really, I'd say the character of all of these projects is in project proposals, which of course is part of an architectural service. But you're right, it doesn't go into detailed design development or contract documentation or construction. But it's certainly the first step in getting things done in the built environment. Any other responses to Errol's observation?
Reinforce what I said before. I really thought that all of the presentations were extremely responsible, intelligent, sensitive to the neighborhood, and so on. I mean, it really very, very worthy research, and something that a developer really could use.
Great.
Extremely well done.
Yeah, I would agree.
To put it in the academic environment that you're in right now, if you take it out of that and put it into the real world, it's quite usable. It was well presented, very sensitive, very well done.
Great. And I think really highlights how important the preservation perspective is to pretty much anything that I feel like sometimes it's lacking in its representation in different endeavors. Not to cut anyone short, though, I think that if anyone else wants to say anything pressing, absolutely, please feel free to. But otherwise, we'll just take a 5-minute break before we present. Before the students present their last project of the semester.
I'm going to type my notes into the chat because I have a lot of things to say and I talked too much in the last presentation.
No, this is great. I know.
It's great.
And feel free to also send it. We'd happily disperse it to everyone so that they have the ability to read it afterwards.
Yeah.
As we wind this one down, I did want to give credit to two of our guest speakers and critics actually on the first two projects, these projects. Brian from the Landmarks Preservation Commission, of course, was there. And then Sandra Stokes was a really amazing resource for these projects. These are people that really know these neighborhoods. And Brian Block was fascinated by what we were doing. And they too said, please, I have constituencies that want to learn, see what you're doing. Well, I think, Tony, thanks for that reminder about timing. It brings us exactly to a little before just about time to break.
Let's say 4 o'clock,
for
John.
only 5 minutes. 4 or 5 minutes. Have a stretch break and we'll regroup on a whole different kind of project on Lake Pontchartrain. Thank you.
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Okay, if we're ready.
Let me just start recording again. Okay. No, perfect. Thank you. Ready when you are, Lynette.
Okay. So lastly, we're looking at Mandeville as a good model for architectural conservation in an urban floodplain. Next. Mandeville is a place of serene charms, including Lakeshore Drive, usually, and architectural gems, both grand and understated. Next. But of course, Mandeville is prone to flooding, especially from rain events and storm surge. And it's been hit hard with flooding throughout its history. This is Lakeshore Drive, inundated after a storm in June 2020. The image on the top right is Flagstaff, a storied historic building on Lakeshore Drive in floodwaters in 1915, and Flagstaff again circled in yellow 100 years later, surviving flooding in 2020. Next. So where are we? For those not familiar with Mandeville, it's a community on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain across from New Orleans. It was incorporated in 1840. The city of Mandeville is outlined in red. Next. Our focus is historic Mandeville, outlined here in yellow. Next. Briefly, some highlights of Mandeville's early history. It was established in 1834, quickly became a resort town, an escape destination from the crowding and various diseases that were plaguing New Orleans. It also continued to flood, so a seawall was constructed in 1937 to offer some protection to the shorefront community. Next. More recently, a big development, of course, was the construction of the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway in the 1950s, with the second span added in 1969. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Mandeville imposed stricter building requirements in order to protect the city's structures. In 2013, the city created the Mandeville Historic Preservation District. Next. That district regulates demolitions and relocations, new construction, elevations, additions, renovations. It's mainly concerned with buildings classified as historic, but generally the district has some oversight over exterior building activity in this whole area. Next. Today, there's much concern about protecting the built environment because Mandeville has so much architectural richness. It might be surprising to some who have never visited to see the range in age, type, and style of historic buildings. There's healthy representation of Creole cottages, bungalows. Next. Shotguns and ranch houses and Queen Anne French colonial craftsman styles. Next. Vernacular traditional cottages, mid-century commercial buildings. So quite a range of heritage worth protecting in Mandeville.
Over the years, Louisiana residents have responded to flood risk in various ways. First, by settling on higher ground along the rivers and bayous, and then by building levees and eventually restoring wetlands. Next. With accelerating sea level rise and less wetland buffer, the state's coastal regions face increased storm surge and flood risk that impacts communities in the form of nuisance flooding and more acutely in the form of qualifying disasters. About 25% of St. Tammany Parish is water, with high rates of annual precipitation on top of more catastrophic events. Since Hurricane Betsy in 1965, St. Tammany Parish has received 16 presidential disaster declarations, more than any other parish in the state. Depicted here is the 2067 predicted storm surge flood risk for the coastal Louisiana area. While flooding in New Orleans is not provoked by storm surge, our neighbors on the North Shore battle this particular issue. Next. In addition to individually elevating buildings above the flood base elevation, Mandeville has the means to approach flood risk holistically with integrated stormwater management and coastal infrastructural change. The St. Tammany Parish adaptation strategy, which diagrams from which are pictured here, proposes a 50-year vision for at-risk areas that incorporates environmental assets and natural buffers and floodplains to provide critical drainage and storm surge protection for the preservation of nearby structures. Next. The structures most at risk of flooding are located along Lake Pontchartrain, where storm surge heights are estimated to reach 7 to 9 feet and are expected to exceed 13 feet in the near future. This area is historic Mandeville, of course, where the most at-risk homes and businesses are also the most historically and architecturally significant. So zooming in to the west is an anomaly along the shoreline, the chunk missing between Sunset Point and the rest of the lakefront. Next. Severe weather and saltwater intrusion have eroded this swampland, not protected by the seawall, reshaping Mandeville's shoreline and increasing flood risk for structures previously considered safe. Marshes and wetlands along Lake Pontchartrain shoreline are important habitats as well as the first line of defense for the city. They divert and temporarily store water during heavy rain events, provide for natural habitat recovery, and offer educational and recreational opportunities that enhance the local economy. Next. Currently, buildings to the east of the cypress forest are the first to flood in historic Mandeville. With homes and infrastructure in the immediate area, restoration of this site is critical for providing the surrounding neighborhoods with protection from storm events. Thankfully, a number of projects are currently underway to reinforce the lakefront infrastructure. Next. A proposal to build out the cypress forest wetlands and add a 950-foot berm and pedestrian walkway has been funded this year and is moving forward with Neil Schaefer acting as prime consultant and civil engineer. So a quote from the project overview: "The Mandeville Lakefront Wetlands Restoration Project will prevent further degradation of the existing wetlands and restore a functioning ecosystem within the area. Stormwater from the Galvez and Messina outfalls will be directed through a created wetlands, improving water quality within Lake Pontchartrain. And finally, a path will be located along the restored shoreline to provide a bicycle and pedestrian link between Old Mandeville and Sunset Point Park." Next. A look at waterfront precedents offers different strategies for combining pedestrian walkways with flood mitigation. So in Brazil, along the northern end of a large
Lindsay, when you said in Brazil, you broke up. So I don't know if you would like to.
Is it better now?
Yes, yeah. So if you start with in Brazil, everything after that we had lost previously, but you can just repeat, please.
Okay, so in Brazil, this urban park along the northern end of a large coastal lagoon incorporates elevated walkways that curve around decks with built-in seating. So you can go to next. In Stockholm, a stepped terrace is used for flood mitigation with jetties that provide a closer experience to the open water. Next. Redevelopment of the Ai River Park in China included flood control, drainage, landscape development, and elevated pedestrian paths and lookouts that give visitors access with minimal human impact for ecological recovery. So elements of all of these design strategies, curving paths, built-in seating, jetties, elevated walkways, could be incorporated into Mandeville's lakefront restoration project to provide an experience similar to that of Mandeville's resort town days. Next.
So for this project, Hannah and I conducted a survey of a representative area of Old Mandeville with the intention of identifying non-elevated structures and estimating their elevation costs. Next, thanks. So the representative study area that we chose is shown in the pink box on this map, and it's centered in the Old Mandeville area. We chose this study area because of the diversity of structural types, uses, and architectural styles, as well as for its location by Lake Pontchartrain. Our survey area was the 9 blocks within the bounds of Lakeshore Drive, Marigny Avenue, Madison Street, and Carroll Street. This map shows the usage types of all the buildings that we surveyed. As you can see, there's a variety of different uses, including residential, commercial, government and civic, hospitality and tourism establishments, bars and restaurants, and also religious and educational institutions. There are only 2 zoning designations present in our study area, and that's B3 shown in red on this map, and that's the Old Mandeville Business District and the majority of our study area. And then there's also R1 in the cream color, and that's indicating single family residential district.
So these are all of the residences that are in our study area shown here in yellow, and called out on either side are some of the more significant examples of different types of architecture in this area. So which clearly shows a diverse group of architectural styles that represent different time periods throughout Mandeville's history. Next slide. And much like the residential building slide, the non-residential buildings in this area are also quite diverse in architectural style as well. And on both sides of Girard Street, from Lakeshore Drive up to the trailhead just past Woodrow Street, would be eligible for placement on the National Register as a commercial district because more than 60% of the structures are certified historic commercial structures. Next slide. And these are images of some of the major recent floods in Mandeville, which has seen 14 flood events in the past 15 years since Hurricane Katrina. And we chose these photos to show that floods don't just affect buildings, and they affect people too. Next slide.
So using the St. Tammany Parish Tax Assessor's website, we were able to pull square footage, assessed values, fair market values, and other metrics into our master survey spreadsheet. We utilized the LSU flood map to ascertain the base flood elevation, or BFE, then added 2 feet per Mandeville's elevation requirements. We ultimately found 90 properties in these nine blocks that were not elevated. So depending on a property's location in either a VE or AE flood zone, we then estimated and recorded the height of these structures, these structures were off of the ground. We collected the coordinates of the 90 properties to georeference them in GIS. The formula we used to estimate the elevation height needed was BFE plus 2 minus ground elevation minus current elevation off of the ground. And this here is a snippet of our master spreadsheet where we collected all this data. So finally, we updated the available 2012 cost estimation figures for residential elevation by foundation type to reflect current 2021 pricing. 1-story and 2-story building elevation costs increased by 10 and 15% respectively. Commercial structures required an additional $15 per square foot if buildings were wood frame and $30 per square foot for masonry. Depending on the elevation height needed, which we rounded up to the nearest whole foot just to be safe, we multiplied the correct price per square foot by the square footage of the building footprint. This simple calculation gave us the general estimates of the cost of elevation for the properties in our study area. In future studies, one could take this process one step further and conduct a cost-benefit analysis, but this was out of the range of our scope this time. Cost to elevate may also be offset by federal funding through FEMA, grants, and other sources. And it's important to reiterate that these figures are approximate estimations and should be used for research purposes only. The true elevation cost depends on a range of factors, such as variations in foundation design, proposed elevation height, the cost of labor from design professionals and contractors, and there should always be at least a 10% contingency fund built in as well.
So before we break from the slides for a second, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what this data looks like from a visual standpoint. So after compiling all of this data on the 90 properties we surveyed, like Laurel said, we geolocated the buildings and put them into a GIS map. But we wanted to go deeper than providing a static map. So what we decided to do was create a web application, which, if you aren't familiar, is a GIS map-based application that can be hosted online and can be reached from any device that has an internet connection. It's fully customizable and the intention was to share our data in a way that's digestible and meaningful. So using the data we collected, we chose to zoom in on two distinct points of analysis: the estimated cost to elevate a structure and the required height of elevation. And we found that the total cost of elevation of all 90 of these buildings was about $16.5 million. So if you want to stop sharing for a second, Tony, I can pull over and share my screen. Everyone see that? Okay, cool. I'll pull this over here. So looking at this map, we've got we've got 3 layers that we decided to show. And what we're seeing right now is just the base points of all 90 of the structures. And they are interactive and you can click on them and it shows up different pieces of data that we collected. So this one would cost this amount of money, it's not elevated, etc. And down here this is the spreadsheet that Laurel made. I made sure to put it in here so anyone could be able to look at it. And besides the base map points, we've also got the estimated cost to elevate, which is shown here in graduated circles, with the most costs being the biggest circles and the smallest costs being the littlest circles. And then the same symbology convention with the estimated height. And so these are also clickable. And if you click on one, and you can see that the estimated height is 5.6 feet. So in the bottom middle here, let's see, let me turn on the right one. You can generate a chart that will show you, it'll display this data in just a different way. So we wanted to just have different ways to look at this data. And you can make it bigger and then adjust, and you can hover over the bars and see that 2013 Claiborne Street in Mandeville will cost $249,000 roughly. And then it also shows them on the map. But we just like to make it a little bit bigger. And the legend over here as well is interactive, and it changes with the layers that you have turned on. So another cool search feature that we have is the search bar up here at the top, where you can search an address, and depending on whether you're wanting to know the estimated cost or the estimated height or both, it'll take you to that exact building on the map. So if I wanted to look up 243 Girard Street, it'll pull up the estimated cost. It'll also point it out on the map, and then also it'll point out how much it needed to be elevated to. And then we also added some filters that can turn on and off. So maybe you only want to look at buildings that are going to cost less than $70,000. You can turn on the filter, and that's where they are. And those filters are completely customizable, and we just chose a couple different ways to show them, but they can be shown in any capacity. And you also have the option to like mess around with this map and print it, and this print button will generate a PDF that you could print if you wanted to. So the purpose of this web app was to make a product and find a way to make all of the data that we collected available to the public in a way that's useful. It's a tool that anyone can use to help them research and make decisions regarding elevation. And I also have shared the link to this app in our group presentation if anyone would like to look at it. Oh wait, here I am again. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so while elevating historic structures in Mandeville is certainly the priority of preserving them, it's also incredibly important to consider and be sensitive to the impact that elevation has on a building or a streetscape scale. Raising a house has a real impact not only on that house's relationship with the street, but the residents' relationship with the street, their neighbors, and other houses. Design guidelines help to establish a unified approach to the inevitable process of changing scale and makes the transition as smooth as possible. Next slide. So take a second to look at each of these before and after pictures and kind of think about what you think, if they work or not, while I go through these guidelines real quick. And so I won't go through all of the guidelines in detail, but here are some of the most important ones that the City of Mandeville has laid out. So one of them is to retain and preserve building and landscape features that contribute to the overall historic character of an individual building and or the historic district, including trees, gardens, yards, arbors, ground cover, fences, foundations, and significant vistas and views. And secondly, to elevate the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or HVAC, and any other exterior equipment in a manner that is unobtrusive and inconspicuous to the extent possible. This holds true for historic residential and commercial buildings, and if possible, place the equipment in the rear of the building or in a place where it can be easily master screened. So the key preservation goals for elevation are to minimize elevation changes for historic buildings, minimize change to visual character by maintaining proportions, relationships, and scale of architectural features, and use historic building facade and entry features to develop new design elements. And finally, for this slide, we can see that some examples of the historic properties in Mandeville before and after they were elevated, and to what degree of success they had. So for the sake of time, I'll just go over an example that we thought was great and one that we thought that could have gone a little bit better according to the guidelines. So the house up in the top left at 306 East Street, is it top left? I think it is, sorry. Does a really great job at preserving historic character while elevating the following guidelines. The elevation is screened with lattice work and makes great use of landscaping to cover the elevation and preserve the relationship with the lawn that the original structure had. The new stairs also do a great job of blending and working in harmony with the original structure, and we can see that the first section aligns with the entryway and the upper level aligns with the first screen porch bay, and the newel posts are aligned with the screen porch framing elements. Then the house at 217 Girard Street utilized CMU piers to raise it, which align well with the original columns. However, the piers are not screened, landscaped, or disguised in any way, and the stairs are not in their original place, but have been relocated, which alters the circulation pattern. And additionally, the HVAC condenser isn't screened or disguised and is visible from the street. So overall, we can see that there are many different ways to elevate a structure, and those ways have varying degrees of success. The guidelines exist to help maintain and preserve the special architectural character of a streetscape while simultaneously implementing progressive policies. Next slide.
Did it progress for everyone? Okay. Did we lose the lake house groups?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, my lag is very bad. Apologies. I'll try to keep up with you. I'll look for your thumbs up, Tony. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to now jump into a few case studies of flood risk assessment and elevation designs, as we were just introduced, using 3 individual buildings in Mandeville. So the first design proposal is for the Lake House Restaurant. Next slide. Okay, so the Lake House was built around 1849 to 1850. It is a double gallery wood frame building standing on brick piers, which are spread throughout what is now a closed-in ground floor, and it is currently used as a restaurant. Lots of other changes have occurred throughout the years, which has resulted in a combination of styles from French colonial to Greek revival to Italianate. Between 1915 and 1926, a single-story wood frame addition was constructed flush with the southeast elevation, which you can see here on the right. In keeping with architectural trends of that time, this addition has some subtle Spanish revival influences, notably the parapet on its front facade. Next slide. All right, just to highlight some of the building's character-defining features, the second floor gallery really contains most of the distinctive elements, such as the chamfered cutout columns, the turned wooden spindles on the railing, and the bracketed cornice. And the fenestration on this floor as well includes casement windows and doors and transom windows. And as I mentioned before, the distinct stucco parapet on the addition is also notable. Next slide. Okay, so the lake house is located at 2025 Lakeshore Drive. And as the building and the street name suggest, it is directly facing Lake Pontchartrain. And you can see on the bottom right how a typical weather event can impact this building. It is located in the coastal VE flood zone, which is the highest flood risk category. And in terms of wind risk, it sits in risk category 2. Likewise, because of its proximity to the water, it's also in the windborne debris region. So there are multiple risk factors compounding at this site. Next slide. All right, and here we see in more detail the flood risk of the building. Indicated in the red lines are all the factors that determine how high we need to elevate this building to achieve FEMA compliance and to mitigate further damage. So we have the mean sea level, the current grade at 4 feet, the base flood elevation at 12 feet, and then taking into account the existing grade, that base flood elevation comes to 8 feet. And then, as Laurel mentioned, the City of Mandeville requires an extra 2 feet to be added, which brings our final elevation requirement to 10 feet from the grade to the lowest structural member. Next slide. Okay, and this is a visual approximation of what that elevation will look like. Later on, we'll go into further detail about the actual design, but this just gives you an idea of how dramatic of a difference it would be. Next slide.
The lake house has defined the character of the lakefront since it was constructed around the late 1840s, early 1850s. It was originally constructed as the home of Bernard de Marigny, then passed to Paul Arsenault, who opened a casino in the building. Next slide. And approximately 1910, it passed to the Bishak family, who would define the character of the restaurant for the rest of the century. In 1915, a hurricane hit, and due to Lake Pontchartrain's definition as a bay, technically an estuary, it's open to the Gulf. So wind-driven water is a problem there, which it was certainly in the case of the 1915 hurricane, in which many buildings along the lakefront lost their stairs, their windowsills, pecan trees, and many structural features. Next slide. In April 1940, another natural disaster hit with the windstorm that came in with strong southeasterly winds. It destroyed several buildings along the lakefront, ripped roofs off, collapsed several buildings, lifted up the garage of Mr. Bishak, and caused damage as far back as 3 blocks from the lakefront. Next slide, please. In the late 1960s, Albert Dennis Bishak inherited the property from his father and began to remove some of the siding. He removed siding from the second floor gallery in the late 1970s. Next slide. And by the early 1980s, he'd also removed the siding from the lower first floor, which brought the property to what we see today. In 1985, another hurricane hit with strong winds from the southeast, and this caused several days of flooding along the lakefront. As you can see, Chef Paul Lauren is hosing down the concrete floor that the Bishak family installed in the restaurant for ease of sanitation. And this was just due to the frequency and severity of floods in the area. Next slide, please. In 1990, Albert Dennis Bishak decided to close the restaurant, but maintain ownership of the property itself. And for the next 10 years, they rented it to a variety of owners. First, Chef Pat Gallagher, then to the Bishak children. Next slide, please. And then it was rented to Chef Alex Patou. 2 years into Patou's tenure, a seafood boiler was left on in the kitchen. It ignited the kitchen, gutted the second floor, and they very nearly lost the roof with its original slate tiles. As of 2008, Vicki Bailey and Cayman Sinclair opened what is now the Lake House restaurant in the building. Next slide, please. Although the building itself has changed quite a bit since its construction, the area around it has had even more of a dramatic change. The buildings to the left were built around 1999. Their elevation leads to their very towering height, which is out of context with the lake house. Additionally, they are several bays wider than they perhaps should be to keep the neighborhood context. To the left is Justine Plantation, which is similar in size to the lake house, but it was elevated. And due to its steeply pitched roof and dormer, it does stand a little bit above the lake house. So in elevating the lake house, we would be safeguarding it from the elements, but we would also be restoring some of the context and the architect's original intentions for how it's seen and understood. And my colleague Mia will discuss that in greater detail in just a second. Thank you.
Now that we know what needs to get done and how the building has changed over time, our team looked at the current state of the building and how it is being used as a restaurant and event space. In this plan diagram, the area shaded in peach is used for the front of house operations. Areas in yellow designate the back of house spaces. The blue highlighted areas denote vertical circulation, such as stairs that connect levels. And finally, gray areas are support spaces like guest restrooms and mechanical closets. You'll notice that the majority of vertical circulation and support spaces are located in the center of the overall building footprint. Our team used these observations about how the building works to make suggestions that are sensitive to architectural preservation, in addition to life safety and overall building functionality. Next slide, please. This is the existing front and east elevation of the building. Next slide, please. So now we'll have some design options. Option 1 is based upon the minimum requirements that would mitigate flood risk with little stylistic interpretation or enhancement to the existing structures. This design option includes additional fire stairs, returning the front entrance stairway, adding an elevator, steel post and cable railings, and lattice breakaway screens along the back of the ground level to create a visual barrier between the open space beneath the restaurant and the undeveloped back of the property. Next slide, please. Option 2 adopts many of the with regard to adding stairs and an elevator, but further seeks to represent and enhance the historic detailing of the building while adding storm-ready windows, painted wooden columns and railings, replacing the former covered porch area of the Mission Style Edition with a period-appropriate fabric or metal awning, as well as steel and post cable railings which enhance visibility of the Mission Style Edition and signage from the street. Next slide, please. Option 3 expands upon the previous recommendations and dares to make the most of the elevation. Since the ground floor of what we know as level 1 must be reconstructed, we propose to expand the interior area of the building by adding a glass hyphen between the earliest historic structure and the smaller 20th century addition. Next slide, please. This is a planned diagram of the building using option 3, the hyphen. Additional fire stairs and elevators provide life safety for occupants, and the square footage that was once an exterior porch on the east elevation is now part of the overall interior of the building to make the most of the elevated area provided.
Tony, we're seeing the, okay, I got it. Thank you. So lastly, we just have a preliminary cost analysis for all 3 of these options, starting with the base cost of elevation. For our purposes here, because this is a commercial building, that base cost has to include an elevator and additional stairs and landings. It will also include storm-resistant helical piles as part of the new foundation, as well as construction costs in order to rebuild the new second floor once it's raised off the ground. And as for the 3 options, this is just a very kind of overarching summary of how they compare to one another in terms of increased complexity and price. So everything in bold italics is an additional feature from the option before. And so option 3 includes everything in the first 2 options and then some, which would obviously be the most expensive design. But for the reasons that we just laid out, we do feel that it is the best option in order to not only meet compliance, but also to celebrate the historic character of the building. Next slide.
Okay, so this next specific case study property assessed is the Beach House Bar and Grill. Next. So the property is located at 124 Gerard Street in Mandeville. It's on the same block as the previous lake house. So it puts it within a mile of the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. And it is in this Old Mandeville Business District. Next. So using Sanborn maps, the Sally Reeves survey, and a set of restoration construction documents from 2007, we were able to make a basic history timeline of the building. So it was constructed around 1900 as a wood frame shotgun double that was also constructed as a raised basement house type on brick masonry piers with a porch. This raised basement type call out is not identified on any other structure in the building's context. At least originally, this type became more common in nearby New Orleans in the earliest 20th century. The building's original porch has since been filled in, and the bottom floor has also been enclosed with the addition from a vernacular house type to a commercial building. The building also has seen the addition of a large detached covered seating and an attached kitchen and refrigeration unit. Next. So the current conditions of the building itself are in good standing, but are in need of updating. You can see the brick masonry piers as well as the corrugated metal roof. You can see this detached covered seating in the bottom left image, as well as in the bottom center image. On the way back under the canopy, you can see this kitchen addition. And then the bottom right image shows the refrigeration unit on the back. Next. So same as the Lake House building, the building is located in a VE coastal flood zone with a ground elevation of about 3.5 feet. So with the required base flood elevation of 12 foot plus the 2 foot per Mandeville, it should be raised around 14 feet due to or 10 foot, but I think we went a little higher just in case. But due to the first floor being enclosed and currently inhabited, the building is presently not in compliance. And so we are going to put some proposals forward to raise it. Next. So because the current building use requires the necessity of the continued use of a second floor, the original wood structure will need to be elevated over 20 feet in the air. Therefore, the building will enter a new wood zone and wind zone and will require some form of wind retrofitting. So here's just some basic information about the steps going forward with that. The inclusion of a wind retrofit project along with the elevation of the building will help reduce or eliminate building and content damage. Next.
So in order to protect this building from future flooding, we considered 3 different options for flood adaptation. This first one is relocation, but we quickly took this off the table because we decided that removing it from its current context would do more harm than good. Next slide. So our next option was to elevate the building, and we considered the program distribution in the building to inform our strategy for elevation, particularly the location of the kitchen and the outdoor dining space. Next slide, please. So our second option was to elevate the building, but leave the covered outdoor dining on the ground level. This option protects the historic built fabric, but may create some difficulties for operation as a restaurant because the kitchen would have to be lifted with the building, and separation of the kitchen and the main dining space could create some difficulties. So our next option was to elevate everything, including the outdoor dining space. Next slide, please. So in the end, we recommended the third option because it maintains the kitchen dining connection. It creates the most space underneath the building that could be used in a number of ways depending on what the owner wanted to do with it. We also recommended the removal of the awning that is currently over the top floor's windows on the front of the facade because it is incompatible with the style of the building, and adding storm shutters to protect the windows now that it's in a higher wind zone. Next slide. So with elevating this building, it would need to meet ADA and egress standards. So we would have to add 2 staircases, one in the front and one in the back, as well as add an elevator into the building. Next slide.
So like the previous group, this is our preliminary cost analysis for elevation work, along with some listed cost variables that also would need to be considered. We were able to calculate the basic elevation is estimated to be around 430,000, but this only includes elevation and not other related construction costs. And Emma kind of went out a little, but I was going to say too, we were able to consult with Roderick Scott on this too. So that's kind of where all of our numbers for all this stuff came from. He was really able to guide us on this. So next. And again, here is our recommended proposal with the addition of people rendering. So thank you. Next.
All right, I will be discussing flood mitigation scenarios for the Dewdrop, Jazz, and Social Hall via design analysis. Next slide. A brief history on the Dewdrop itself. On May 5th, 1885, a group of civic-minded African-American residents of the village of Mandeville, led by Olivia Unio, created the Dewdrop Social and Benevolent Association, which would be in the hall. A decade later, the organization laid a cornerstone in 1895 and constructed this barge board and millwood building on Lamarck Street in what is now Old Mandeville. The association, like many created among African Americans, were created after the Civil War and had chiefly the benevolent goals to care for the sick with food and protection intentions, to provide help in funeral arrangements, provide food for other needy, and also temporary housing, all during a period of time when Black residents could not obtain various types of insurance. The hall on Lamarck Street, unpainted and nestled in a grove of ancient live oaks, is now considered the world's oldest, virtually unaltered, rural jazz dance hall still used today, and also as a performance venue. According to scholars, its erection in 1895 breaks the year of birth for traditional jazz in New Orleans and abroad. The Dewdrop currently sits at 2,112 feet away from Lake Pontchartrain, which is a little bit less than half a mile. It is along Lamarck Street and in between Monroe and Madison Street. It is partnered with the Dewdrop is the First Free Mission Baptist Church, and then the Musicians Room across Lamarck Street, which is an elevated shotgun house. Dewdrop sits at a ground elevation of 6.5 feet. It has been elevated on stucco brick piers at 2.5 feet, and its base flood elevation is at 10 feet. It is about 840 square feet. Next slide. For scenario one, this would be leaving everything as it is with the metrics I just gave you. The pros to this concept would be the structure retains its visual aesthetic. The structure builds comfortability with flooding, and the sound aesthetics are not minimally or are not compromised. I should state that with the materials being from barge board and former sawmill, and there being a lack of great structural insight in this building and being more of a box-like structure, the sound qualities are incredibly desirable for musicians to play here. So that's where it gets much of its popularity and notoriety as a performance hall. The cons to keeping everything the same in a flood scenario. The materials are affected by water, possibly negatively. That might impact the wood more than first initiated. Insurance increases, and historic fabric is at risk of damage for future use. Next slide. And the next concept, the piers would be elevated to 5.5 feet, and that would add 2 feet above the base flood elevation of 10 feet. The pros to this concept is water does not enter inside the structure, insurance decreases, sustainability increases, allowing historical fabric to survive. Some possible cons to this idea is the sound aesthetics are possibly compromised, being elevated, allowing a different height of atmosphere with the trees around it. New amenities such as the stairs and the ramp would be added, as you see the single landing kind of grand staircase. And overall, that changes the visual historic aesthetic that was previously with the Dewdrop's look. Next slide. Scenario 3 requires an unused drastic implementation of elevation with the auto lifting permanent system. The auto lifting system would be based from an industrial truck lift system. 3 of these would have to be implemented below dewdrop to maintain a balanced elevation each time flooding occurs or recedes. Industrial truck lift systems can lift up to 90,000 pounds, 45 tons. Similar to dewdrop, trailer homes, which are at 800 square feet, weigh up to 40,000 pounds. Therefore, a lift system would not have issue constantly lifting dewdrop. However, due to dewdrop's box-like structure with few beams and joists, a new structural base at minimum would need to be installed to satisfy the auto lifting system. This new framing would require 3 42-foot steel I-beams to run the length of dewdrop back to front, and for the auto lift system, which 3 would equal this length. Furthermore, 14 2x8 wood beams would run along the width of dewdrop side to side. And these 14 beams that are 2x8s would be 20 feet in length, which is the width of dewdrop. So, thank you.
Excellent. Well, that was a very coherent presentation of, again, a huge range of problem types, project types, and scales. So before we get into Q&A, I think it was said earlier that we had really seriously good input from professionals advising us on this project, in particular Roderick Scott, a national authority on elevating buildings, and his wife Louisette, who's the former city planner for Mandeville, among others. So I'll stop because this is all about hearing feedback from our guest critics.
Maybe I'll
Terry,
just sort of jump in.
Start us off. Okay, Brent, okay.
No, what I was just going to say, you know, from a 40,000 foot perspective, to me, as I said in the review a few weeks ago, this work is incredibly important. And I think, you know, from my conversations with folks who do this kind of work in Galveston, Houston, and the new IDRT, I'm working with those guys out of TAU in Galveston, and Cleary, I'm sure you as well, working with Fiber in Florida and Marty Hilton and others. You know, more emphasis needs to be placed on the historic built environment when calculating these broad scale community and county and statewide risk assessments and wider resilience efforts for the Gulf, for everywhere in the world. And so I think, you know, the work that you've done here really should be pushed out much more broadly than it is just in this report, because I think it's critical to incorporating the historic built environment in the wider calculations of resilience in the 21st century. So I would just, again, applaud you all for this work. And I think I asked for the attribute table from Hannah, because I think that, you know, that attribute table covers sort of the risk and then the cost of recovery really well, but there's so much more data that we can begin to fill in between those attribute data points that can allow us to build up a much more robust predictive measure of how disaster events will impact historic buildings. So I think that, you know, that attribute table is a great place to start, but we can start filling in much more information, particularly from historic hazard events that are now available through FEMA, and begin to widen out our understanding and predictive ability for resilience efforts.
I'll just say, can you hear me okay? I put in my microphone. Okay. Boy, I'll just say, you preservationists have a big challenge ahead of you as you go into this profession, because this is really complicated and really difficult work. And you've done a really good job of examining the complexity of this question. I really appreciate all the effort that you put into the costing, the elevation analysis, the kind of design guideline review of your before and after. Somebody's got a great job being a preservation planner ahead of them. The acoustic analysis and the assessment of auto lifting for dewdrop, also great. I think, I think this just raises some larger philosophical questions as well, which you're gonna have to start thinking about when you do this work. And it's a really hard thing to think about. And what I find so interesting about this project for you is that you have gone from doing those kind of urban planning, urban scale investigations to some real architectural investigations here for adaptation and modification of buildings. So I find that really interesting. But the larger work here is that, these architectural mitigations have to be done in collaboration with landscape architects, with green infrastructure, which I really loved the precedent studies that y'all did, looking at those soft, landscape infrastructure for restoration of the wetlands, but also policy. And unfortunately, we are at the mercy of the insurance companies. And what I would really love to see more of, that we've seen in Annapolis with the work that Lisa Craig did on the Annapolis Main Street, is the investigation of wet flood proofing and dry flood proofing for historic buildings, because we have to ask the question, is it always the right thing to do to raise a building? One of the things that I think was pretty evident when you looked at the before and afters of elevations, nobody's raised that ranch building that's sitting on a slab on grade in that neighborhood. So, these are the difficult challenges that we're going to have to deal with when we start thinking about mitigation. Also, someone mentioned we considered removing the building from the current context and thought it would do more harm than good. I actually think you should look at moving it and where it might go. You have to explore multiple avenues because this is a temporal issue, right? So you can do mitigation for the next 10 or 20 years, and then we have to start thinking long-term. What's going to happen to Mandeville in the long term, and where might we want these buildings to go? And are there buildings that might not be worth saving? And so these are the really hard philosophical questions that we're all going to be dealing with in the future. But I think you've done a really great job of working with the architecture for this time frame that we're working in today. So, and good luck in the future, because it's a real challenge.
I'd like to chime in just for a second. I agree with everything you just said. These are highly speculative, proposals. But aside from that, I thought that the care and detail that you all brought to bear on these things was unusual for student projects. I really, having practiced architecture for a long time, and having had the difficulty of getting projects built and figuring out budgets, et cetera, I thought that the detail that you all brought to this and the clarity of the options was really, really professional. You all really should be congratulated for that. I mean, this did not seem like student work to me. It seemed like the work of fairly accomplished professionals. So congratulations for that. And I would, if I had to sort of critique the individual design things, that's another, another whole topic. But I was very, very impressed with the professionalism of the research and the presentation. So congratulations for that. I'm particularly taken with the Dewdrop Inn project because it's such a simple building, so it was very easy to imagine that that could actually happen. And the restaurant with the 3 levels and all that's a complicated project and probably wildly underestimated in terms of its cost. But the Dewdrop building, which was just a little box, and that was really convincing the way that was presented. And but again, they were all good. I mean, I really was impressed. Very, very good indeed. Congratulations.
Just adding to Errol's comment about, so many points here, but two Tulanians had a big hand in all of this. Lynn Mitchell saved the Dewdrop Inn, and he graduated maybe when you started teaching early on. Errol, he's a Tulane architecture graduate. He was an advisor to our class right here, who was very, very valuable in that. And then also Jesse Keenan was a resource for this project. Jesse Keenan, world famous on this topic. He said, like you said, Errol, thank you. He's not seen anything like this in the way of detail and professional product in the whole School of Architecture. So we really have something to be proud of with this class, who's worked so well as a team, listening to one another, working with one another, and above all, getting into the technical stuff. And someone please respond to Clary's point about slab on grade. We definitely looked at some examples, but what did we decide to do?
Tear them all down.
Yeah, those are the ones that maybe aren't worth saving, but please, someone they looked at elevating slab on grade buildings, right?
Yeah, that's something that I looked at with Rod's help. I went through the spreadsheet that we'd created row by row, and he basically double checked my work. But we talked about the slab on grade, like raising the entire building, including the slab versus slab separation. So it is possible and it is done. Although I think there are a lot of people who, it's obviously more difficult and expensive to do that rather than raising something that's just on piers. So I think there is some resistance to that, but hopefully in the next few years that will start to change. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
And you also made a great point about the eligibility for the National Register Historic District for the commercial district. And so, thinking about new fiscal incentives for being eligible and in dealing with building adaptation. So that, that might be another great policy change that happens in the near future.
We're finding Mandeville has found its place in changing policy on the issue of elevating buildings. So 10 years ago, they went ahead to the National Park Service, who said, no elevating, rule you out, to where NPS now has a whole guideline on how to elevate buildings for flood mitigation purposes. So here with Roderick's input, we're also showing how FEMA support and many other funding sources can be correlated with National Park Service or National Register distinctions, which is tricky, this interagency stuff, without blowing it, because it's all about funding. The bottom line of all of this is there's lots of public funding available for people if they move on this, and we are trying to show how it can be done. Last call, we're kind of winding down. Please, all students are welcome to comment on anything, including what you've learned this semester.
Yeah, this is a perfect time for wrapping up the afternoon and any last thoughts or open to anyone, as John mentioned.
I don't want to keep repeating the same point, but I think you all should take a lot of pride in the sort of professionalism of the students. And I mean, I'm not just saying that to make you feel good about the semester, but it really was very impressive. I was quite prepared to duck out about halfway through, John, but I stayed to the end.
Yeah, you told me It all reflects our philosophy, deep philosophy in the program is to prepare people to do real world work throughout the program. There's not a minute or a dollar to waste on fooling around. And the other theory is to have these students ready to hit the road on Monday after graduation, not after knocking around in the field for 4 years. So I really, honestly, I know I talk in superlatives all the time, but I would put this class to a person up against anyone I've ever met early in their professions. They're ready to go. And I honestly think they all have jobs on offer from at least the Mandible people and others who have heard their brilliant presentations. It's just a great, great group. We've had a blast working with you. I have to say, the COVID and mask notwithstanding, which was such a weird year, but we did it. We did it well, and you all were amazing good sports about all of that, and a joy to work with as individuals. Your spirits are wonderful, and the Tulane institution as a vessel in which all of this happened has just been wonderful too. God, didn't we have some great resources to work with? Human resources, physical resources, history, what? It's all there. We drank deep. And Tony, you can have the last word here unless there are other interventions from elsewhere, but we do need to stop, sadly.
Let me ask one question. I know Grover Mouton in the Tulane group, the urban research group he ran some years ago, did a report on Mandeville. Did you all look at that?
That's how this all started. Grover introduced me to Mandeville. I kind of took over from some of his work.
Any of this flood stuff.
So I met Lizette and then Roderick, and then that. So we really are following Grover's early work right here, but they didn't get into flood mitigation.
Yeah, I mean, but really, how unrealistic is that?
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, you have to admit, this is a beautiful project for just this study. And another resource we had with the project, Jacob Foreman said, dude, this is a story across the whole Gulf Coast of the United States and on up the Atlantic seaboard. So what we're talking about here has relevance all over the place.
Yeah, I live in uptown New Orleans. I always wanted a beachfront property. I guess I'm going to have one.
Okay.
Tony,
you may have the last word.
See it coming.
No, I mean, just overall, coming up with the structure for a semester is incredibly exciting to work with John on. And I am completely shocked about how much more excited I got for every single project as I watched you develop your work. The level of rigor and interest and engagement, and also, there's a really great group dynamic here that was incredibly just like helpful. It just pushed everything into the stratosphere in terms of your final products. And I'm so excited after having worked with all of you to have all of you in the profession. If you are not already part of the profession coming up, and just forward, I appreciate your critical thinking and I appreciate the questions you asked. And I really think that engagement is the thing that is going to help keep preservation a part of all the conversations involving all the facets, as I had mentioned earlier today, but just really help bring this to all of the career paths that you take, which are going to be as completely varied as each and every one of you. So I just wanted to say thanks and also lend my compliments, even though I know that you've gotten that as well today.
It was very, very professional. So congratulations.
Great to hear from you.
Thank you so much for thanks for our guests for joining us for so long today.
Exactly.
Good luck on your exams, everyone.
Yes,
in what time?
It was a grand afternoon. The joy of learning, we were really on an odyssey of learning this semester, and that we did very well. So over and out for this presentation, this course, this semester. So onward, get that rest, and We will see you up the line. Thank you all ever so much. Wonderful afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
And I have,
Great
I have
job,
now,
guys.
oh, thanks. Yeah.